Welcome back. Before we begin our spooky adventure tonight, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with other horror enthusiasts to give us more motivation. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so leave a comment below and cheer me on YouTube. Chapter 1. The Night the Rule Broke. I did not tell the rest of this story for a long time because the next part sounded less like fear and more like consequence. Fear is easier for people to understand. Fear is a noise in the dark, a shadow by a tree line, 3 taps where there should not be any wall to knock on, a figure in a hoodie moving through fog at the exact speed your body cannot catch, a handprint on the inside of a truck window, a black stone sitting beside a tool that vanished and came back too clean to belong to the world you know. People understand those things because they fit inside the idea of a haunting, a bad place, a wrong night, a thing in the woods. What came after was worse because it did not feel like a thing chasing us anymore. It felt like a rule I had broken without understanding it. And once broken, it did not stay in the cabin. It came home with us. It settled into our habits. It moved into silence, into the spaces between words, into the way my father drove and breathed and held his body like a man already listening for a sound that had not happened yet. After I said the name out loud in the cabin, we left before sunrise. Neither of us framed it as a retreat. We did not say we were scared. We did not say we needed sleep. We packed in that stiff, efficient way people pack after a funeral, as if being useful might keep something from reaching into you. Dad moved through the kitchen gathering coffee mugs, a half loaf of bread, the dish towel he'd hung by the sink as if the place were ordinary. I shoved chargers, spare batteries, my flashlight, and the toolbox into duffel bags with hands that did not feel like they belonged to me. No one had slept. The cabin had gone quiet after our argument, but not in a peaceful way. The pressure in the air had eased just enough to let us breathe, and that was all. The walls held our voices. The floors seemed to remember where the wet drag mark had been. The windows reflected only our own faces back at us, and somehow that felt worse than seeing something else. By the time we locked the front door, the eastern sky had only just started to pale. The pond beyond the clearing was a black sheet with no shine on it. The trees were just columns in the dark. Dad stood on the porch for 1 second too long, his hand on the railing, cigarette carton heavy in his jacket pocket, not touching it. Then he stepped down and walked to the truck without looking at the woods. The drive out should have felt like relief. It did not. The access road rattled beneath the tires the way it always had. But the truck felt wrong around us, too closed and too damp. Dad drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders locked, eyes fixed ahead. He did not lecture me. He did not ask why I had done it. He did not tell me not to say the word again. He did not even look angry. That was how I knew the silence had changed. Before, his silence had always been made of fear hammered into stubbornness. It had edges. It wanted to become denial. He would go quiet because he did not want to give the woods anything by speaking into them, or because he was angry and wanted to force the world back into shape by pretending it was still made of practical things: wood, nails, money, permits, weather. This silence was not that. This silence felt like recognition. Like a man who had just heard a lock engage somewhere behind a wall and knew, without seeing it, that something in the structure had shifted. The radio should have picked up a station once we got off the deeper stretch of road. It always did. Some thin country station, half static and half heartbreak. Instead, it hissed and crackled between stations that were not there, the sound rising and falling like someone breathing through sand. Dad reached over once, turned the dial a fraction, then turned it off entirely when the static sharpened into a dry, papery rasp that made the hair on my forearms lift. I stared out the passenger window and tried not to think of names. The side glass had a faint bloom of condensation on the inside. That should not have been possible. It was cold and dry outside, the kind of brittle early morning air that empties your lungs clean when you breathe it in. The truck heater was not on. We had been moving for 15 minutes, still. A haze had gathered along the edge of the window nearest my shoulder, a soft fogging where warm breath might have been if someone had been sitting close to the glass for a long time. I wiped it with the heel of my hand. The smear cleared, then slowly dulled again. Dad noticed. I know he noticed because his right thumb tightened on the steering wheel until the knuckle went white. But he said nothing. The cigarette carton remained untouched in his coat. He had started carrying that thing like other men carried medication. He never took it out now unless he was at the tree line. Even then, he did not smoke. He split the cigarettes, spilled the tobacco, pressed it into dirt with 2 fingers, and walked away like he had not just paid a tax to cross his own land. I was angry at him for that. Angry because he had rules he had never fully explained. Angry because he had let me think the silence was enough, that if I just obeyed the rhythm of the place long enough, we could keep building and call that survival. Angry because some part of me believed he had known more than he ever said. I was angrier at myself because I had wanted to test it. That was the ugliest truth. Not that I had slipped. Not that I had said the name by accident. I had wanted to force the world to answer. I had wanted to make fear become information. I had wanted to say, "See, it is just a word. See, we can name a thing and not belong to it." Instead, the air inside that cabin had changed so quickly and so physically that my body recognized the mistake before my mind did. Even now, sitting in the truck, I could remember the way pressure had hit my ears, the way the lamp had flickered like a pulse, the way Dad had come into the room with his face gone pale in the low light. Not angry first, afraid first. That was the part that would not stop working at me. I kept replaying the exact look in his eyes and thinking he did not react, like a man hearing a superstition spoken aloud. He reacted like a man hearing a trap spring. We hit County Road just as the sun edged over the horizon. The sky lightened to a clean blue-gray, the kind of morning that would have looked harmless to anyone else. Small farms, long ditches silver with frost, utility poles, mailboxes, places with names and addresses and property lines, and all the normal geometry of people. I should have felt the woods falling behind us. Instead, I kept thinking of the cabin locked in the clearing with our breath still inside it. Dad drove in silence all the way to town. When we finally pulled into the motel lot we had used before, it was still early enough that the neon vacancy sign looked embarrassed to be on. The parking lot was half empty. A minivan with 2 bike racks, an old work truck with mud dried into fan shapes over the wheel wells. Normal. Cheap. Safe in the way walls and fluorescent lighting are supposed to be safe. Dad killed the engine but did not get out right away. For 1 second, we just sat there in the cooling truck, both of us looking forward. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't say it again." Not angry, not sharp, tired. I looked at him, waiting for more. He opened the door and stepped out before I could answer. Inside the motel room, the air smelled like detergent, old carpet, and the stale aftertaste of air conditioning units that never really shut off. It should have felt comforting. It should have been insulting in its normalness after the cabin. Instead, it felt staged, like the world had laid down a set built to resemble safety and expected me not to notice the seams. Dad took the bed nearest the door without comment. That had become his habit since the first weeks on the property, though he never admitted it. He liked himself between me and the entrance now. He unzipped his bag, took out his meds, a clean shirt, the folded hospital papers he still carried as if bureaucracy itself could protect him, and set them on the nightstand. His movements were precise, controlled, too careful to be casual. I took the other bed. Neither of us said we were staying only one night. Neither of us said what came next. I went into the bathroom to wash my face. The sink looked clean enough. White basin, chrome faucet, little paper band around a cup no one ever used. I turned on the water and bent down. Before the stream even warmed, I caught the smell. Not strong, not enough that anyone else might have stopped, but I did. A faint, cold smell rose out of the drain and reached me before the water did. Pond water that had sat too long. Wet leaves pressed into dark mud. The breath of a basement after summer rain. It was the smell from the truck, from the cabin floor, from the wet lines on the porch. It did not belong to chlorinated motel plumbing miles from the pond. I shut the water off and leaned closer. One hand braced on the sink, telling myself drains smell sometimes. Cheap places have old pipes. Mold exists. It was a rational explanation. I tried it on, and it slid right off. When I straightened, the bathroom mirror had begun to haze at the edges. I had used cold water. The room was not steamy. The exhaust fan was off. Still, the glass filmed over in a slow bloom that made my own face look as if it were pushing through fog to reach me. My heartbeat stumbled hard once in my throat. I stood still and watched as a bead of moisture gathered near the lower corner of the mirror frame and slipped down, leaving behind a narrow, wet line. Just one. Thin, deliberate, familiar. It fell onto the tile. I looked down. A dark seam no wider than a shoelace had appeared on the floor, starting near the base of the vanity and dragging outward 2 feet before stopping as abruptly as if whatever made it had been lifted. I could smell the damp earth more clearly now. Not enough to fill the room, enough to claim it. I backed out of the bathroom so fast my shoulder hit the doorframe. Dad looked up from his bed immediately. For a second I considered lying, because that had become our shared language. No proof, no escalation, no feeding it with speech. But my face must have given something away, because Dad did not ask what happened. He only said, "Bathroom." I nodded. His jaw tightened. Not surprise, confirmation. He stood, slower than he used to, and walked past me into the bathroom. He did not flick on the brighter vanity light. He did not crouch. He did not go hunting for evidence. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and looked inside the way a man looks at whether he has learned cannot be argued with. Then he shut the bathroom door. Not hard, gently, like closing a room on a sleeping child. He came back to his bed and sat down. "That's not the cabin," I said, hating the thinness in my own voice. "No," he said. "Then what is it?" He rubbed his face with one hand and said nothing. That silence was answer enough to get me through the rest of the day, in a state I can only describe as suspended. We did not go out for lunch. We did not walk around town. We ate from a vending machine and the gas station next door because leaving the room felt wrong. Though I could not have explained why. Every time I glanced at the bathroom door, I expected to see dampness creeping out from under it. It never did. By late afternoon, the smell had faded. By evening, the mirror was clear. Normal returned too neatly, the same way it always had at the property. That was when I began to understand the shape of the problem. It was not location the way I wanted it to be. Not a haunted cabin, not one bad clearing, not one wrong patch of woods that could be solved by distance. Whatever had attached itself to us was not sitting in the cabin waiting like an animal in a trap. It had moved into our notice, into the fact that we had learned its pressure, its timing, its signs. The cabin had not been the center. It had been the first room where we recognized the rules. That night I slept in scraps, half dreams, sudden waking, my body jerking for no reason into alertness that arrived before sound. Sometime after midnight, I woke fully and realized the room was dark, except for the low orange glow from the parking lot curtains. Dad was not in his bed. For 1 second, I thought he had gone back, that he had taken the truck and driven all the way to the property while I slept. The way some men return to a fight because losing it in public feels worse than death in private. Then I saw him. He was sitting at the little table by the window. No overhead light, no lamp. Just the spill of sodium orange from the parking lot painting half his face and leaving the rest in shadow. The cigarette carton sat by his elbow, unopened. One hand rested flat beside it. The other covered his mouth as if he were praying into his own skin. At first I thought he was simply sitting in the dark. Then I heard him. Not English. Not exactly another full language either. At least not one I knew. It came out in short, low phrases, broken and halting, as if he were trying to remember something from childhood that had not been spoken in 40 years. Syllables scraped smooth by disuse. A few English words caught between them. Leave, cross, keep, sorry, mother. His voice was so low I could not make out more than fragments. He was not chanting. He sounded like a man trying to fit old pieces together in the dark without waking anyone. I lay still and listened because the alternative was to interrupt him. And interrupting felt too close to stepping into something private and fragile. The more I listened, the less it sounded like prayer in any simple sense. It sounded like apology, like asking permission, like speech from a place beneath speech. At one point, he stopped and turned his head slightly toward the bathroom. My whole body went cold. He did not get up. He only stared at that closed door for a long 5 seconds, then looked down again and resumed in that broken, low rhythm as if the words themselves were a line he needed to keep hold of. I did not sleep again. By morning, I was too tired to pretend patience. Dad came back from the motel ice machine with a plastic bucket and 2 coffees balanced on top like the world was ordinary enough to require routines. He set 1 cup down near me. He took his medication dry, winced, sat in the chair, and looked out the window as if weather mattered more than anything either of us had heard or smelled or seen. I said, "Tell me the truth." He did not move for a moment. Then he gave a tired half shrug that might have meant, "Which truth?" "You knew more than you said." I told him. "You've known more the whole time." He kept looking at the parking lot. Cars came and went. Someone loaded a suitcase into a sedan. A woman in scrubs hurried toward the office carrying an energy drink. The ordinary world went on with such insulting steadiness that it made my voice harder. "You don't get to do that anymore," I said. "Not after last night, not after the bathroom, not after the cabin. You knew what I did when I said it. You knew." His jaw worked once. When he finally looked at me, he looked older than he had at the hospital. Not physically weaker. Emptier in a way. Like withholding had been costing him more than he wanted me to see. "My mother used to talk about places," he said. "That was all at first." I waited. He rubbed his thumb against the cardboard coffee sleeve again and again, eyes on the movement. "Not haunted places," he said after a moment. "Not demons. Not the kind of thing white people put in books and turn into one creature with one name." Then what he exhaled through his nose. Places that were kept. The word sat in the room and changed the air around it. Kept by what he shook his head once. That's the wrong question. I almost laughed from exhaustion. It's a pretty reasonable one. No. His voice sharpened, then softened again when he heard himself. "No, it's not. That's part of it. You start asking what, like it's an animal or a person or a thing you can make into a shape. My mother said some places aren't kept by a somebody. They're kept because something happened there long enough, or often enough, or hard enough that the place remembers. And once it remembers, it doesn't always let go." I stared at him. He held my gaze this time. "She said there are pieces of land that stop behaving like land. They start behaving like agreements." I did not know what to do with that. So I said the practical thing. "And you knew our property was one of those. I knew there were stories." He looked away. "I knew she got strange whenever that road came up. I knew she made a point of carrying tobacco if we drove near there. I knew she said not every place wants a house on it. Then why did you build one?" The answer came too fast. Because I thought I could. There was no pride in it. Only the tired ruin left behind when pride has failed. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a second. "You have to understand something about men like me," he said. "Fear doesn't always make us back off. Sometimes it makes us do the dumbest possible version of bravery. My whole life, that land was sitting there in my mind. Someday I'd build on it. Someday I'd make it ours in a way that couldn't be argued with. Someday I'd make a real thing where all those old stories couldn't live anymore." He laughed once, bitter and quiet. "I thought if I put a house on it, if I ran lines and poured concrete and framed walls and made it into a place with light switches and a mortgage trail and my name on the deed, then whatever old wrongness was there would have to become background. History." He opened his eyes. I thought building over it meant closing it, but it didn't. No. He looked at his own hands. It woke it up. Or maybe it didn't wake anything. Maybe it just forced an answer. I let that sit. The room hummed with the air conditioner and distant traffic. I could smell burnt coffee. My head hurt from too little sleep and too much thinking. Still, as he spoke, certain things began to settle into a pattern whether I wanted them to or not. The missing tools returned. The nail gun centered on the floor like an offering. The stone, the black sand, the figure that led me but never touched me in the circle. The pressure that held but did not kill. The knocks, the drag marks. Dad's headaches easing when he left tobacco, worsening when he did not. It was not random. It had never been random. I sat with that for a long while after Dad stopped talking. He did not push for a response. He looked exhausted from saying even that much. I got up, paced once to the window and back, and finally sat on the edge of my bed with my elbows on my knees, replaying the whole chain from the first missing nail gun forward. If it wanted us dead, there had been chances. I had followed it alone into fog with no trail behind me. Dad had slept exposed on a subfloor in the woods. He had nearly fallen twice. He had pushed his heart to the edge of failure in a place that seemed more than capable of taking advantage of weakness, if that was the goal. The thing had entered the cabin. It had touched the porch, the walls, the floor, the truck, the motel bathroom, for God's sake. And still we were here, changed, frightened, smaller than before, but alive. I said the thought out loud before I realized I was doing it. It doesn't want to kill us. Dad's head lifted. It could have, I said. And now that I had started, the rest came with the cold clarity of something that had been waiting for a shape. It kept taking things and putting them back. It led me out there, but it didn't leave me dead. It made you sick, but it didn't finish anything. It keeps showing itself just enough for us to recognize it and then pulling away. Dad did not interrupt. My hands had started to shake, not from fear exactly, but from the awful relief of pattern. It wasn't trying to drive us away, I said, hearing the truth of it as the words formed. It was trying to force us to understand what we were standing on. The sentence landed between us like a third presence. Dad closed his eyes for 1 second, then nodded once. Not agreement, recognition. After that, the question became obvious. If understanding was the point, then leaving and pretending never to return was not escape. It was delay. We could go home. We could lock the cabin. We could stop saying names and keep our voices low and spend the rest of our lives stepping around certain subjects the way people step around old family violence. But if the place had already attached itself to our behavior, then silence was not safety anymore. It was just obedience without knowledge. I hated that more than I hated fear. By noon, I knew I was going back. I expected the fight when I said it. I expected Dad to tell me no, to say we had done enough, to say some things are not meant to be dug at, to tell me that curiosity is how people disappear. Instead, when I told him, he only looked tired. Yeah, he said. That threw me enough I had to ask twice. Yeah, he repeated. We go back. I stared at him. That's it, no. He sat forward and planted both feet carefully on the carpet. We don't go back to build. We don't go back to challenge anything. We don't go back so you can stand in the clearing asking questions into the dark like an idiot. His voice stayed flat. We go back to find out what was taken, or what was moved, or what was left unfinished. I watched him, waiting for the rest. He stood, crossed to the closet, and pulled out the long cardboard tube that had carried the original cabin plans for years. I had seen it 100 times. Graph paper inside, elevations, measurements. My father's someday dream rolled into a portable object. He unscrewed the cap and shook the papers gently into his hand. Blueprints slid free. So did something else. A small folded sheet, yellowed at the edges, tucked flat between two plan pages the way a pressed leaf is hidden in a book. The paper had been folded and refolded so many times, the creases looked like white scars. Dad held it for a second without opening it, his thumb resting along the top edge with a tenderness I had not seen in him all summer. What is that? I asked. He did not answer immediately. When he finally looked at me, there was no point denying anything anymore. My mother's, he said. The room seemed to draw inward around that little paper. He had hidden it from the beginning, maybe not from me specifically, maybe from himself. Tucked inside the plans like a warning, sealed inside the dream it might undo. And in that moment, the last clean part of my anger vanished, replaced by something colder and more complicated. He had never been walking blind through any of this. Not fully. He had known enough to hide evidence from his own hope, enough to carry his mother's folded warning all the way to the land and still believe a house might be stronger than memory. That was the real break, more than the name I had said. Not that something in the woods had heard me, that my father had known this place had a history, and built anyway because he thought he could force the past into the shape of a home. He opened the paper very carefully. I did not read it yet. I only watched his face as his eyes moved over words he had probably known by heart for years. The motel room hummed around us, somewhere outside. A car alarm chirped and stopped. Afternoon light crawled across the carpet. Dad looked up at me and said, "If we go back for the truth." Then he laid the paper on the bed between us like a thing we had both finally earned the right to see. Chapter 2. What my grandmother tried to leave behind. The paper was smaller than I expected. That is one of the details I remember most clearly, which probably sounds strange after everything that came later. But when you spend weeks building a shape in your mind around an old family secret, you imagine something theatrical, a long letter, several pages, a confession that explains itself in clean paragraphs. What Dad laid on the motel bed between us was only a single folded sheet, yellowed soft with age, the edges feathered from being handled too many times. It looked like the kind of note somebody might leave on a kitchen counter before stepping out to buy milk. That made it worse, because it meant whatever my grandmother had wanted to say had once belonged to the ordinary world. A pen, a scrap of paper, a warning written by a woman who still had dishes in the sink and groceries to put away and laundry hanging somewhere in another room. Not a prophet, not a madwoman, not the kind of person men like my grandfather would ever have taken seriously if she raised her voice. Dad smoothed the paper against the motel comforter with the flat of his hand. His left hand trembled slightly when he did it. He did not mention the tremor. He never did. He leaned forward and read silently for a moment before he slid the page toward me. The handwriting was smaller than his, neater too, though age had made the blue ink bleed at the edges. The first line had no greeting, no date, no name at the top, just instructions written in the compact, practical hand of somebody trying to fit too much onto too little space. Do not build close to the water. If you hear 3 knocks, do not answer them. Do not say back the name other people use. It does not keep people for no reason. It keeps what was promised. Some places are not meant to be improved. They are meant to be crossed carefully. If you take away a sign, you become the sign. That line stopped me. I read it again, slower this time, feeling the shape of it more than its meaning at first. The room around us seemed to thin out. Cheap motel walls, air conditioner hum, parking lot outside. All of it receded while those words stayed fixed and hard in the center of my attention. If you take away a sign, you become the sign? Below that was one more sentence, tucked in almost as an afterthought, though I knew by then better than to trust placement. If he ever goes back there, go with him. The last word had been pressed so hard it nearly cut the paper. I looked up at Dad. For a second, I did not know which part to ask about first. The knocks, the water, the name, the promise. The sign. The fact that she had apparently predicted he might go back long enough in advance to write something that sounded like she had already lost the argument in her own head. So I asked the only question that felt large enough to hold all the others. What was promised? Dad did not answer right away. He sat back in the chair by the motel window and rubbed his palm slowly over his mouth, looking everywhere except at me. That was his tell when the truth was close enough to touch, but still costly. Not dramatic. Never dramatic. Just the smallest stall in his body. The way a man checks a weak board before he puts his weight on it. I don't know all of it, he said finally. I almost laughed from frustration. You knew enough to hide that in the blueprint tube. I knew enough to know she meant it. That's not the same thing. He gave me a tired look that might have become anger in another season of his life. But there was not enough energy left in him for that now. No, he said. It isn't. He reached for the note again, but instead of taking it back, he touched the last line with one finger. She wrote this after my father got serious about buying that parcel from her cousin, he said. Or that's what she told me later. Depending on the year, depending on her mood. She said it had belonged to family before that, and then passed sideways and then came back around. Land stories get messy when nobody can afford lawyers. You were a kid. Yeah. His eyes stayed on the paper. Old enough to remember her keeping tobacco in a little tin by the back door. Old enough to notice she always got strange whenever that road came up. Young enough not to understand what she was trying to tell me. He lifted his head then and met my eyes with an exhaustion so old it felt inherited. I thought this was about fear, he said. The kind old people carry because they came from harder places and harder years and had names for the world. Modern people don't like anymore. I thought if I grew up and made money and had a truck and plans and permits and enough batteries for every tool in the garage, I would belong to a different version of reality than she did. He gave a dry, humorless smile. Turns out all I did was arrive at the same place later and with better equipment. I looked back down at the note. Do not build close to the water. The sentence was simple enough to sound practical, like advice from somebody who understood rot, flooding, frost, something you might hear from any old-timer who had watched enough foundations shift over enough winters. That was what made it unnerving. Every line sat exactly on the border between folklore and common sense, the way truly dangerous things often do. Refuse an answer to 3 knocks in the middle of the night and you sound superstitious. Answer 3 knocks in a place where every instinct is already telling you not to, and you become a man with a story nobody believes. Why didn't she write more, I asked. Dad looked toward the bathroom door like he had the night before, even though nothing moved beyond it now. Maybe because she knew if she wrote everything down, my father would have burned it. Maybe because saying too much felt like its own kind of reaching. Maybe because she only knew pieces. Or maybe because she expected you to ask her. That landed harder than I intended. He looked away. A long silence followed. I heard somebody in the next room laugh too loudly at a TV show. Somewhere farther off, a toilet flushed. The ordinary world kept leaking in under the door and around the edges of the curtains while I sat there holding a note that had already predicted enough of our lives to make me feel physically cold. I read the line again. It keeps what was promised. What did she mean by that, I said. Not the whole thing. Just what did she think was promised? Dad exhaled slowly. A boundary, maybe. A crossing. A mark. Something between one side and another that somebody wasn't supposed to remove. He paused. Or somebody. Could have been a person promised to respect it. Could have been a family promised to leave it alone. You keep saying maybe, because she never explained it straight. That doesn't feel true. His jaw tightened. I had hit something. She explained it the way old women explain things when they know the men in the house are listening. He said, sideways, while cooking, while folding shirts, while pretending to talk about weather. He reached into his overnight bag and pulled out his wallet. Then from the wallet, a small, faded photograph I had never seen before. He handed it over carefully, as if the motion itself carried weight. The picture showed my father as a boy, standing beside a woman I recognized, only because I had seen her in one framed image my whole childhood. My grandmother, younger than I had ever known her, hair pinned back, face serious in that old camera way people mistake for sternness. Behind them stretched woods and a sliver of dark water that I knew immediately was the pond. Dad could not have been more than 10. They were standing by the edge of a rough path. At first, all I saw was trees. Then I saw the thing half hidden to the left of them, a stake no taller than my father's waist, wrapped near the top with what looked like a strip of faded cloth. Something dark sat at its base. Stones. Maybe. Or one larger rock. The image was too old and grainy to tell. My pulse skipped. That was there, I asked. Dad leaned forward and looked at the photo as if he had not studied it 100 times already. Yeah, he said softly. I guess it was. Guess I didn't think about it back then. It was part of the background. His eyes narrowed. My mother used to stop when we passed that spot. Never crossed right there, always around. Why he gave me a look almost offended by the question, but not because it was foolish, because the answer had become obvious too late, because she knew something I didn't. The more he said, the more the story stopped feeling like an external haunting and started feeling like a family argument carried across generations and translated badly each time. My grandmother had known enough to leave a note. My father had known enough to hide it and still go forward. I had known nothing except the shape of fear when it finally put its hand on the wall beside me. I asked him then about her. Not in the general way families ask after dead relatives they have reduced to roles over time. Mother, grandmother, widow, church lady, cook, keeper of holidays, but specifically, who had she been before she became old to him? Where had she grown up? What did she actually believe? Dad surprised me by answering. Not cleanly, not in order, but honestly in a way I had not heard from him since I was a kid and feverish and asking questions too late at night. His mother, he said, had not grown up on that piece of land itself, but near enough to it that the road and the water and the names around both had threaded through her childhood. Her people had moved in and out of that county the way poor families moved anywhere in America following jobs, following relatives, following crises, losing property, getting a little back, then losing it again. The pond parcel had belonged once to a branch of family by marriage, and then to someone else, and then been rented and neglected and passed over for years because it was too remote to be useful, except to the sort of people who thought remoteness was a blessing. She used to say the place didn't go empty just because white folks stopped counting it. Dad said. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought it was just one of those lines old people have. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the photograph. Her younger brother disappeared there for a day when she was maybe 12. That's the story I heard the most growing up. He went out after something stupid, maybe a dog, maybe a fishing line he thought somebody had stolen, Depends on who told it. They found him near dusk, sitting in dry leaves in a stand of pines not far from the pond, looking straight ahead like he'd forgotten what faces were for. I stayed very still. He wasn't hurt. Dad continued. No blood, no broken bone, no bite marks, nothing dramatic. That was the problem. He was just not right. Wouldn't answer when they said his name. Didn't cry. Didn't act scared. Just sat there with dirt under his nails, and this look on him like he was listening to something that hadn't finished speaking. What happened to him, he came back around. Mostly. Dad said the word like he hated it. A couple days later, he was talking again. Ate normal, slept, helped with chores. But according to my mother, he was never exactly the same. He would not cross certain parts of woods after that. Wouldn't go near still water after sundown. If he heard 3 knocks on anything, door, wall, truck bed, he'd freeze. Not because he was being dramatic, because his body went there before his mind did. That put a pressure under my ribs I had no language for. He told her anything. Not clearly. She said when he did talk about it, he did it like a sick person describing a dream. He kept saying he followed something that stayed the same distance ahead of him, and every time he thought he was coming out, the trees changed. Then he said there was a place where the woods stopped and the air got heavy, and somebody told him not to step on the wrong side of a line he couldn't see. Dad paused. After that, my grandmother got serious about markers. I looked up. Markers. He nodded. Cloth. Stakes. Stones. Tobacco. Places where she'd stop and mutter under her breath and refuse to let us cut through. My father hated it. Thought it was backward. Thought it embarrassed him. He wanted fences and survey maps and county records. He wanted a cleaner kind of ownership, and she didn't. He gave me a tired, crooked smile. She believed ownership was the part men say out loud. She thought the land had a vote too. It would have sounded ridiculous if the summer had gone any other way, sitting in a motel room with a handwritten note and a faded photograph. After pressure shifts and missing hours and a thing too tall to stand inside any common idea of the world, it sounded less like superstition than simple fact spoken in a dialect I had not been taught. Dad told me then about his father, not my grandfather, as I had known him in old age, stiff-backed and contemptuous of anything that could not be measured. But the younger man, under that finished surface, proud, angry at poverty, angry at old ways because old ways had not made him rich, determined that whatever world his wife came from, his children would grow up on the cleaner side of it. He didn't want those stories in the house, Dad said. Said they made people weak. Said all they did was keep poor folks poor and afraid of dirt. My mother got quieter because of him, not because she believed less. That felt true immediately. I had known that kind of marriage. Most families have one somewhere in their line, if you go back far enough, a private religion of dismissal, where one person survives by learning to speak only where the other cannot hear. She kept leaving tobacco anyway, I asked. Yeah. He smiled without humor. Not in front of him, if she could help it. The room had gone dim without me noticing. Afternoon had turned to the early gray of evening. Dad switched on the lamp by the bed, and the sudden light made both of us blink like men coming up out of deeper water than we realized. I asked him then whether my grandmother had ever actually told him what the marker by the pond meant. No, he said. Not directly. But she said there are places where one world gets too close to another and needs a sign between them. He watched my face carefully as he said it, maybe to see if I would flinch. She said signs aren't always there to keep something out. Sometimes they're there so the living remember where not to stand. That sentence followed me all the way into the next day. Because if it was true, then everything we had suffered that summer had a different shape. Not punishment for existing, not random malice, a correction. A line we had crossed without understanding, then crossed again with concrete and lumber and a legal deed, until whatever held memory in that place decided we were going to understand one way or another. We went looking for somebody who might know more because family stories, by themselves, are too easy to treat like weathered exaggeration. I needed another voice. Somebody outside my father and his guilt and his mother's folded note. Town has a way of hiding the people who know the most by making them look the most ordinary. The woman we found lived on the edge of the county in a low house with aluminum siding and 3 half-dead rose bushes out front. Dad called her Miss Lena, though she must have been in her 80s and clearly old enough to have once slapped him for calling her anything else. She had known my grandmother through church and family overlap and the sort of old rural social net where everyone was somebody's cousin or former neighbor or shared grief. She answered the door in house shoes and a buttoned cardigan, looked at my father once, then at me, and said, "You boys waited too long. No greeting, no invitation. Just that." Dad's mouth tightened, but he did not deny it. Inside, her house smelled like Vicks, old furniture polish, and something savory cooking low in a crock pot. There were framed school photos on every flat surface, a ceramic bowl of peppermints, a recliner with a crocheted blanket folded over one arm. No occult nonsense, no dramatic atmosphere. It made what she said next feel heavier because it came from a room built entirely out of normal life. When Dad told her about the cabin, about the knocks and the missing time and the things returned clean, she did not gape or bless herself or ask whether we had been drinking. She got tired, not frightened, tired. That woman told him not to fool with that place, she said, meaning my grandmother. Told him plain as she knew how. But men like your daddy, she nodded at Dad, here warning as insult. Dad took that without protest. She left tobacco, Miss Lena said, looking at me now. You know why, to offer it? I said. She clicked her tongue. Not offer, not buy, not worship. To ask to pass. She sat down slowly in the recliner, every movement stiff with age. There's a difference between feeding a thing and acknowledging you're crossing somewhere that don't belong cleanly to you. Your grandmother knew the difference. I thought of Dad at the tree line, cigarette split open in his hand. She called it what I asked. That place near the pond. Miss Lena rubbed the bridge of her nose. The old folks called it the kept place when they were feeling plain. Had other names too, depending who was talking and who was listening. But that's the one I heard most as a girl. Dad spoke for the first time in several minutes, kept by what Miss Lena gave him a flat look. You still asking that question at your age? He looked down. She sighed. Don't matter what. Matters that it is. Some places stay separate and some don't. That one doesn't if you stir it. I told her about the tools being taken and returned. The note, the wet marks, the pressure, the figure staying just far enough ahead to lure. I left out the name I had spoken. Not because I believed in secrecy then, the way I came to later, but because even in her small, warm living room, with a crock pot bubbling and a game show muttering low on mute from the television, the thought of saying it made the back of my neck tighten. Miss Lena listened without interrupting. When I finished, She leaned back and closed her eyes for a second, like an old woman measuring out how much truth younger people could survive at once. Then she said the line that changed everything. "If it's brought things back," she said, "that means it's still waiting for you to carry the right thing there yourselves." Neither of us spoke. She opened her eyes again and looked at my father with something harder than sympathy. "If it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. If it wanted your boy kept, he wouldn't have come back. If it keeps handing your things back clean and centered, it's telling you plain enough what kind of wrong this is." Dad's voice had gone rough. What kind? The kind where somebody removed a mark and then tried to live on the gap. I felt cold flood my limbs. Miss Lena pointed toward the window, though there was nothing there but winter-browned grass and a chain-link fence. Boundaries ain't there just to stop crossing. They teach crossing. They remind you where it costs more. Somebody before you knew enough to put one there. Somebody after that figured paper and money mattered more. Her eyes shifted to me again. "That was your family's mistake, not the cabin. The cabin just made it harder to ignore." Back at the motel, we went through everything we had. That sounds orderly. It was not. It felt like rummaging through the wreckage of a story to find the one splinter that would explain the rest. Dad emptied an old banker's box he kept in the truck for documents. Deed copies, tax records, badly folded survey maps, receipts from lumber and hardware runs, a county printout of parcel lines, a plastic envelope of old family photos he had apparently been carrying for years without admitting it. We spread everything across the bed, the desk, both nightstands. The motel room disappeared beneath paper. I handled the photographs first because they required less interpretation and more instinct. There were snapshots of the land from different decades, none labeled clearly enough to be useful at first glance. The pond in summer, dark and glassy. The rough access path before we cleared it. Trees before they were thinned. My father younger, shirtless and sunburned, standing by the truck in the 90s with a chainsaw he was too proud of. My grandfather in a cap, expression already arranged into disapproval. My grandmother in one image only, at the edge of frame, turned away. I shuffled through them one by one until a shape snagged my attention. It was another old photograph, this one faded almost to brown. A winter shot by the look of the bare trees and the hard white brightness over the water. In the foreground stood a stake wrapped with something pale, cloth or maybe ribbon, worn dark in places. At the base lay a ring of stones, not decorative, not random, deliberate. Too deliberate to mistake once you had spent a summer being taught what deliberateness looked like in the woods. I handed it to Dad without speaking. He took one look and went still. "That was there," I said. "Yeah." Where he squinted at the background, as if distance and time could be focused away. Near the clearing, closer to the water side than I remembered. Or maybe not. Hard to tell. Is it still there? We both knew the answer before either of us said it. No. There had been no stake when we cleared the site. No wrapped cloth. No stones marking any kind of line except what we had found in the circle, and what had been arranged and rearranged around our tools and porch like messages. I looked at him slowly. His face changed before he spoke. The way a face changes when memory is not clean enough to arrive as one scene but too persistent to deny. "I might have moved it," he said. The words came out flat, almost detached. "You what?" He rubbed his forehead, eyes narrowed against something inward. "Not now. years ago. Maybe when I first brought you out there as a kid. Maybe when I was clearing brush one summer before I had the money to really start the build. There was an old marker near the path, and I remember thinking it was junk. Some leftover survey stake or somebody's hunting sign half rotted into the ground. My mouth went dry. And I pulled it up. He swallowed, or kicked it loose, or tossed it into a brush pile. I don't know. I didn't keep it because I didn't think it mattered. The room seemed to contract around us. I looked back down at the photograph. Pale cloth, stones, a marker no one in the family had ever thought important enough to mention to me. But important enough for my grandmother to stop near, circle around, carry tobacco past, and write a note about years later as if she knew exactly what happened when men decide a sign is only trash because they do not understand the language it is written in. We spread the survey maps beside the photograph. Dad found the most recent copy and another older hand-drawn sketch that looked like it had been copied from some earlier family paper long since lost. We measured by rough landmarks because land memory is never as exact as lawyers want it to be. The pond curve, the logging trail, the slope toward the East Pines, the rectangle of the cabin foundation. At first, I refused the conclusion because it felt too precise in a story that had so far moved through dread and implication. But the more lines we traced, the less room there was to pretend. The old marker in the winter photograph stood almost exactly where the front corner of the cabin now sat, or close enough that the whole structure straddled the same invisible passage it had once marked. Not random overlap, not vague proximity. We had built directly over the place where something had been telling people for decades, maybe longer, where to cross carefully and where not to stand. The realization hit with a force so physical I had to sit down. Dad lowered himself slowly into the chair by the desk and stared at the maps as if they had become a verdict. "So it isn't the land itself," I said quietly, "or not all of it." He did not answer. "It isn't angry that we're there," I said, following the shape of the thought as it clarified. It reacted because we erased the boundary. We took the sign away and put a house there. Dad's throat worked once. "Yeah. And the circle in the woods was probably the other end of it," he said. "Or the real center, or the place the marker pointed away from. I don't know." I looked again at the note. "If you take away a sign, you become the sign." My stomach turned over. That was what the whole summer had been, wasn't it? We had become markers through behavior, through pressure, through training. I had learned paths without deciding to, learned when not to speak, where not to stand, when to stop moving. Dad had learned to leave tobacco at the edge of the clearing. The land no longer needed the original stake because it had started writing its line into us. That thought chilled me more than the figure in the hoodie ever had. Dad broke the silence first. "We have to put it back," he said. "Not rebuild, not sell, not burn the cabin down in one dramatic act of repentance. Put it back." The wording mattered. "We have to find exactly where it was," I said, "and the circle, and whatever else belongs there." He nodded once. The plan formed almost by itself after that. Because once the problem had a shape, movement returned to us. We were going back to the woods, but not to argue and not to survive another night. We were going back to locate the old line, to find the clearing I had been led into, and to return whatever my father had taken or destroyed when he pulled that marker up and called it junk. It should have felt like action. Instead, it felt like accepting terms. We had just started gathering the photographs and refolding the maps when Dad's phone buzzed on the desk, hard enough to make both of us flinch. No call, just a weather alert. Rain later, wind overnight. He silenced it and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "We leave in the morning," he said. I nodded. That should have been the end of the chapter in any normal story. Decision made. Papers gathered. Next step clear. But before we could finish packing the box, Dad's face changed suddenly and he said, "There's one more person." "Who?" He hesitated. "Miss Lena didn't say all of it." "How do you know?" She looked at me the same way my mother used to look at my father when she was deciding how much truth a man could stand without turning it into anger. He grabbed his keys. We drove back to Miss Lena's house just before dusk. I assumed she would be annoyed. Instead, when she opened the door and saw us standing there with the old photograph in Dad's hand, her expression shifted into something like resignation. "You found it," she said. Dad held out the picture. She did not take it. She only glanced once and nodded. "Then you know where you built?" "Close enough," Dad said. She looked past him at me, and whatever she saw in my face must have answered some question for her. She stepped out onto the porch and closed the screen door behind her so the house sounds stayed inside. The evening had that brittle quiet just before dark. A dog barking far off. Wind moving at ground level through dead grass. Her porch light had not come on yet. "If you boys go back," she said, "you go together." "We will," I said. She shook her head. "I don't mean same truck. I mean together, same purpose, same mind, same direction." Dad frowned. "We're not kids. That ain't what I'm warning you about." Her eyes stayed on his. That place can only draw off the part of a person still trying to beat it. If one of you goes in wanting to win, wanting to prove, wanting to see more than you should, that's the one it'll peel away. I felt that like a hand at the back of my neck, the hoodie in the fog, the exact distance I could never close. My own anger doing half the work for it. Miss Lena saw the recognition land and gave one short nod. It only gets the one still leaning forward. No one said anything for a moment. Then she added, quieter, "Bring back the right thing. And don't mistake apology for challenge." She went inside after that without further explanation, leaving us on the porch under the first weak flicker of the light coming on overhead. On the drive back to the motel, Dad held the photograph in one hand at red lights as if he still expected it to change if he looked long enough. I watched the dark gather along the tree lines outside town and understood the true shape of our mistake at last. Not that we had built a cabin in deep woods. Not even that we had built it on troubled land. We had torn out an old boundary because it looked ugly, unnecessary, and older than our plans. Then we had poured ourselves directly across the gap and called that progress. That was why the place had not tried to drive us away. It had been trying to put the line back. And now that we finally knew it, there was no version of this story where we got to stay ignorant and remain whole. Chapter 3. We went looking for the circle on purpose. We went back just after first light. That detail matters, because in every other version of this story, the land had dictated the hour. We arrived when work demanded it, or slept there because daylight had run out, or stumbled into the worst parts of it because pride or exhaustion had made us careless. Even the morning I followed the figure in the fog had not really been my choice. I had been lured by anger, by curiosity, by that old stupid human belief that if something shows itself in a shape you can chase, then catching it must still be possible. This time there was no illusion of accident. We packed for the cabin the way people pack for a visitation. Not like builders, not like campers, not like men heading for a weekend by the pond. The back of the truck held no circular saw, no heavy boxes of nails, no extra coils of extension cord, no levels, squares, spare bits, or bragging weight. There was food, but plain food. Things that could be eaten cold without the performance of domestic comfort. A loaf of bread, peanut butter, 2 apples already bruising at the edges, jerky, bottled water, a thermos of coffee, 2 small hand shovels, 1 short-handled mattock, my father's cigarette carton, the old photograph, the folded note from my grandmother, sealed now in a plastic sandwich bag as if moisture or time still had some claim on it. 2 survey maps, a length of weathered cloth we had chosen in town because it looked closest to the faded strip in the old picture. A cedar stake cut smooth the night before in the motel parking lot under yellow light while my father said almost nothing. And wrapped in an old dish towel, tucked into a cardboard box so it would not roll, the black stone and the jar of dark sand I had hidden from him, and then finally handed over after there was no point hiding anything anymore. He had not yelled when I showed him the jar. That was what frightened me. He had only looked at the condensation beaded on the inside of the glass, then at me, then set it very carefully into the box as if it belonged with the rest of the things we were taking back. The road out to the property looked the same as it always had. That was another cruelty of places that go wrong slowly. The outside world rarely volunteers to help you confirm what you know. Trees were trees, frost silver ditch grass, mailboxes leaning off county roads, a gas station that sold bait and cigarettes and the kind of coffee that tasted burnt enough to remove memory. We passed all the same shapes as before, but this time there was no argument in the truck, no defensive silence sharpened by denial, no country station sputtering under static. Dad drove with the radio off. I held the old photo in my lap and kept glancing between it and the woods sliding by outside, as if the land might confess something in daylight if I looked at it hard enough. My father kept one hand on the wheel and the other close to the cigarette carton in the breast pocket of his jacket. Not touching it, just keeping the weight of it near him like a charm he did not trust enough to wear openly. The tension in the truck was still there, but it had changed shape. The first time we drove out to build, the tension had been ordinary money, weather, his health. The question of whether father and son could finish something together without turning all their old love into friction. Later, the tension had become fear, then argument, then quiet rules and survival habits. This was neither fear nor survival exactly. It felt like traveling toward a place where somebody had already asked a question on your behalf a long time ago, and now your name had come up in the answer. When the access trail finally opened ahead of us between the trees, my stomach tightened so hard I had to look away for a second. The chain on the gate hung where we had left it. The cabin roofline showed itself through the pines in pale angles. Cleaner than anything on that property had a right to look. The clearing beyond sat still under weak morning light. Dad killed the engine and did not move. Neither did I. The truck clicked as it cooled. Somewhere farther out, a crow called once and then not again. "Still want to do this?" he asked. I knew by his tone that he did not mean the drive, not the clearing, not even the cabin. He meant the act of going past fear and into meaning. He meant the difference between a haunting and an explanation. The cost of that difference. "Yeah," I said. He nodded once. "Then don't go trying to get ahead of me. That would have sounded absurd a month earlier. A father saying that to an adult son. but I knew what he meant. He did not mean speed. He meant intention. The old warning from Miss Lena, the place only peeled away the one still trying to win. I won't, I said. He looked at me hard enough to decide whether I was lying, then reached for the keys and pocketed them. The cabin stood waiting in the clearing like a finished lie. Siding pale in the morning. Porch rail solid. Windows dark with their own reflections. The same house my father had dreamed of for 20 years. The same structure that had felt, on completion, like a clean answer to fear. Now I could barely look at it without seeing the invisible line we had buried beneath it. We carried our things inside in 2 trips. The air in the cabin had that shut-up smell of wood, insulation, dust, and faint lingering cold. Not wrong yet. Not right either. It felt like walking into a room where an argument had happened the night before, and nobody had opened a window since. Dad set the map tube on the table, laid the box with the stone beside it, and stood for a moment in the middle of the living room with his hands on his hips, as though he were trying to feel where the old pressure lived now. I put the food on the counter, leaned the shovels by the back door, and turned slowly in place. Listening. The cabin made its ordinary little sounds. Settling wood. The small electric hum of the mini-split. A faint ticking from pipes in the wall. Domestic noises. Nothing dramatic. Still, both of us were braced. I do not know what made Dad speak first. Maybe it was the note in his pocket. Maybe the memory of my grandmother. Maybe he was just too tired to maintain the old performance any longer. He looked toward the back windows, toward where the woods started beyond the porch, and said out loud, in a plain voice, "We didn't come to stay." The sentence hung there. Then he added, "We came to put back what was moved." Nothing slammed. No lamp flickered. No pressure wave dropped from the ceiling. No wet drag appeared out of nowhere across the floor. Instead, the air changed in the opposite direction, subtly, but unmistakably. The tightness in the room eased just enough that I noticed it had been there, not gone. Lessened, like a hand that had been resting with 2 fingers on the back of your neck had lifted without letting you forget the touch. The cabin did not feel welcoming after that. I do not want to cheapen it by pretending the house sighed in relief or anything sentimental like that. But the hostility softened by 1 degree. The place seemed to stop holding its breath against us. Dad felt it too. I knew because he closed his eyes for half a second and exhaled in a way that looked involuntary. "It reacts to intention," I said quietly. He did not answer, but he did not need to. We stood there absorbing that awful little mercy for maybe 10 seconds before the back door clicked. Both of us turned. The door had not blown open. The weather stripping was good. The house was sealed, yet the latch eased as if pressed from the other side, and the door opened an inch, then another. Just enough to show the black line of the frame against pale morning outside. Not invitation. Direction. The smell reached us next. Pond water left in cold shadow. Wet leaves. Basement damp. The exact old smell that had threaded itself through everything from truck windows to motel drains to the inside of my sealed jar. It came under the gap in one low, steady ribbon. I walked toward the door before I meant to. Dad caught my sleeve. "Slow," he said. We moved together. He opened the door wider with 2 fingers, careful in a way that had become second nature to him. The back porch looked empty, boards dry, railings still. The woods beyond stood in a washed-out morning light that should have made everything feel ordinary. At the threshold, near the seam where floor met sill, lay a narrow streak of black sand. Not spilled, not scattered by accident. Drawn. It started just inside the back door, as if carried over the threshold grain by grain, and ran outward across the porch in a line no wider than a finger before thinning and disappearing toward the far edge, exactly in the direction of the trees. The sight of it did something to my heartbeat. Not because it was new, because it was so unmistakably familiar and so stripped of performance. The thing was not trying to frighten us now. It was pointing. Dad crouched with difficulty, his left hand briefly closing against his thigh before he steadied himself. He did not touch the sand. He only stared down at it with his face gone old and gray around the mouth. "She used to say signs weren't always warnings," he murmured. "Sometimes they're instructions," I said. He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks there was no argument waiting in his eyes, only fear, and something that looked close to trust. We ate standing up before we left the cabin, though neither of us was hungry. That too felt important. A practical act. Peanut butter on bread, water, coffee that had already gone lukewarm. The kind of thing you do before labor or a funeral or any other task where your body will demand fuel, even if your mind has turned away from the idea of appetite. Then Dad opened the carton, split one cigarette, and tucked the tobacco into the pocket of his jacket instead of setting it at the tree line yet. He slid my grandmother's note into the same pocket on the other side, maps folded beneath his arm. We stepped off the porch side by side. There was no hoodie figure waiting at the edge of the clearing. Some small, ashamed piece of me had expected one. Not because I wanted it, because I still measured fear by the clarity of the lure that had once led me. That was how thoroughly the place had trained my imagination. If there was no human-like silhouette to follow, some part of me did not know whether to move. But the woods did not offer us that old shape now. Instead, they gave us traces. The black sand line on the porch continued in intermittent signs across the hard-packed earth behind the cabin. Not enough to walk like a road, just enough to keep us aligned if we were paying attention. A smear caught in the bark of a stump, 3 damp grains at the base of a root, a little crescent of dark against pale frost. There were stones too, black and wet-looking, though the ground around them was dry, appearing at intervals no wider than a few yards apart, not newly placed in front of us, merely noticed now, as if they had been there waiting for the correct angle of intention to make them visible. We moved slowly into the woods. No one spoke for the first 100 yards. The silence there was not total. Branches shifted faintly in the higher air. Somewhere far off, a single woodpecker struck once, then not again, but close around us, sound thinned. The ground was a mattress of needles and leaf litter that muffled our steps. Every few yards we would pause and one of us would point there. A dark pebble under fern. There. A branch bent low and not broken by weather, but pressed as though by a careful hand. There. A strip of cloth gone almost to threads, caught around the base of a sapling at ankle height. The deeper we went, the more the path seemed less like a trail and more like a conversation conducted in objects. I understood then why the figure in the hoodie had not appeared. That had been for me when I still required a shape to follow. Something my pride could misread as a person, and therefore a problem I might solve. Now the woods assumed a different kind of literacy. Marks, signs, disturbances. A line restored one clue at a time. Dad was breathing harder than I liked by the time we were 10 minutes in. Not because we were climbing, but because memory itself seemed to cost him effort. He paused once with a hand against a pine trunk and closed his eyes. "You all right?" I asked. "Yeah," but he shook his head a second later. "No. He looked around us with a face so stripped of defense it startled me. "I know some of this," he said softly. "That's the worst part." I waited. My mother brought me near here once, maybe twice, never all the way in. I remember the feeling more than the path. That pressure, the way she'd go quiet, the way she'd make me stop if I got too far ahead. I think I forgot on purpose. There was no self-pity in it, only shame. I had never seen my father allow himself to sound like a son. That may have been the true turning point between us. All summer long, I had still been secretly measuring him against the man he had been before his stroke. The father who drove too hard, worked too long, swallowed fear by calling it laziness in other people, treated caution as insult, even after the hospital, even after the tremor, even after the tobacco. Some stupid part of me had still been waiting for him to turn back into a challenge I needed to survive. Now, following stones and black grit deeper into a silence that felt older than we were, I saw a different man walking beside me. Not a broken one, not weak. Just finally unable to hide that he had inherited his fear from somewhere real, and that all his years of stubbornness had been one long attempt to build over it with plywood and debt and declarations of ownership. I slowed my pace without making a show of it. He noticed. "Don't do that because of my heart," he muttered. "I'm doing it because I don't want to lose the markers." That was only half a lie. But he accepted it. And maybe he knew why. We became, for that stretch of woods, what Miss Lena had told us we had to become the same purpose moving in two bodies. If I saw dark sand before he did, I pointed and waited. If he noticed a bent branch or a hidden stone, he tapped my sleeve and we adjusted together. No one rushed ahead. No one tried to decode more than the next few feet. The place would not allow victory. It allowed only attention. More signs appeared as the woods tightened around us. At one point, the smell of damp earth thickened so suddenly, I thought of the motel bathroom and had to swallow against a rush of panic. Then I saw why beneath a low shelf of roots lay a flat black stone the size of a hand, slick-looking as if fresh from water, half buried in dry leaves. Near it sat a scrap of cloth so faded it might once have been red or orange or brown. Age had stripped it to the color of old blood washed too many times. Dad crouched there longer than he should have, staring. "That's her kind of tying," he said finally. What he touched the cloth with one finger. My mother used to knot fabric like that, tight and low, not decorative, fixed. The woods around us held still while he said it. Then farther on, we found branches cut low, not by saw or storm, but by something older trimmed once long ago and grown back twisted. An old line, a passage somebody had meant people to follow or avoid. There were even places where silence pooled in a way that made your ears ring. Little pockets in the morning where even our breathing sounded reluctant. Every time we entered one, my skin prickled with the memory of the circle, and Dad's mouth thinned as though a headache threatened to come on. Each time we waited, each time it lifted if we stayed still and moved only when both of us were ready. The forest had stopped behaving like scenery. It had become testimony. We found the clearing almost all at once. There was no fog this time, no shifting treadmill of trunks, no hoodie shape slipping 30 yards ahead. One moment we were in trees. The next they ended in a clean ring, as if cut back by geometry rather than growth. The open space lay before us under a pale noon sky, and the sight of it made every muscle in my back go hard. It was the same place. Even in daylight, even without the fog, even with no pressure strong enough yet to put me on my knees, I knew it at once. The circle was too exact. Not mathematically perfect, perhaps. Not if you measured it with instruments. But perfect in the way an old scar is perfect once you know where to look. The trunks around it stood with an unnatural sense of agreement, evenly spaced and inward-facing. Their lower branches were sparse, as though something had discouraged growth there for years. The ground inside the ring was flatter than it should have been, though not empty. Dark stones sat in patterns too deliberate to belong to chance threes. Small lines, angled groupings that tugged at the eye the way symbols do even before you know how to read them. The center was slightly sunken. That detail chilled me more than the stones. Not by much, inches, maybe, but enough that the eye felt drawn inward and down. The earth there was darker too, compacted differently from the pine needle floor outside the ring. Not wet, not fresh, just used, somehow, as if years of attention had pressed shape into it. No birds crossed above us. No insects moved at the edge. No wind came into the circle, though I could see the tops of the surrounding pines stirring lightly. And the pressure, that old thickening in the air, was there not crushing as it had been when I stumbled into the place alone, but present enough that my ears filled slightly and my molars felt the world in a way teeth should not. I stopped at the exact place where memory had once tipped into panic and realized something with a cold clarity that almost made me laugh. The first time I had not been brought here to die. I had been brought here to see everything since then, the return tools, the black stones, the wet seams, the trained paths in my own body had been one long insistence that I understand the location of the wound. This was it. Not the cabin, not even the property broadly. This place where the woods agreed around an absence and a line had once stood nearby to keep people from treating it like ordinary ground. Dad stood beside me with his face gone pale. He did not try to step in. For a long moment, we only looked. Then he said, very quietly, "She brought me here." I turned to him. He had not taken his eyes off the clearing. She never crossed into it. She stopped right where we're standing and made me stop too. Told me if I ever came back here grown, I was to bring back whatever my people had carried off. He swallowed. I thought she meant land, or money, or old pride. I forgot the rest. Did she say what the sign was for not straight? He shook his head once, as if angry at the gaps in himself, only that it was there to remind folks which side they were on. And if it ever went missing, somebody had to restore it before the place started doing its own reminding. The phrase settled into my bones, doing its own reminding. That was us. Had been us all summer. Dad reached into his jacket and took out the folded note. He did not read from it, only held it in his hand as though the paper itself linked him to the person who had known these woods before he learned to look at them like inventory. She made me promise, he said. What kind of promise that if I ever forgot and came back with too much of my father in me, I'd stop when the place told me to stop, and if I still had any sense left after that, I'd put the sign back. He gave a small, wrecked laugh that had nothing humorous in it. I guess this is what stopping looks like. We circled the clearing once without stepping into the center, not because we were cowards, because by then, caution no longer felt like surrender. It felt like reading. The stones did not make a complete ring. They formed a pattern around the depression, directional almost. with open gaps that aligned loosely toward the pond on one side and toward the old path on the other. A relationship, not a wall. The more I looked, the less the place resembled a trap, and the more it resembled the site of a damaged instruction, on the far side of the circle, half hidden under roots and leaves. Dad found the first thing that made us kneel, the top of a rotten stake. Only 2 inches showed above the earth. Dark, softened by years. I might have mistaken it for old wood debris if he had not sucked in breath through his teeth and pointed with a hand that shook harder now from recognition than from illness. We cleared around it carefully with our fingers first, then the small hand shovels. The wood gave almost immediately. Not because it was new, but because it had once been shaped and then buried too long. The more we exposed, the more obvious it became that this was no random branch. One end had been cut flat. The shaft was straight in a way forest growth rarely is without reason. Around it, embedded in the dirt, lay 3 black stones and the remains of cloth so decayed, it came up in wet-looking threads despite the dry day. We worked without speaking. I do not know whether either of us was afraid to name what we were finding or simply unwilling to break the concentration. The small shovels bit into compacted earth with soft, granular sounds. Needles gave way. Roots resisted and snapped. Dirt darkened as we went lower. It was not deep. That was the disturbing part. The marker had not been hidden in some buried chamber or old grave. It had been only just beneath the surface all these years. Close enough that a person who knew where to look could have repaired it in an hour. Close enough that generations of not looking were themselves a kind of choice. Alongside the wood and stones, we found a metal token no bigger than a silver dollar, dark with age and dirt. At first I thought it was a coin. When I rubbed it against my jeans, the surface revealed not currency, but a stamped design worn nearly smooth. A simple border. A hole at the top, as if it had once been tied to something. On one side, faint beneath grime, a family initial. Not mine exactly. Older. One used by my great-grandfather's branch of the family on cattle marks and tool chests and things meant to travel through men's hands. I held it up toward the pale light filtering through the branches. Dad stared like he'd been struck. My mother had that. He whispered. You're sure? He nodded slowly. She kept it in a drawer with spare buttons and old church envelopes. Said it came from her uncle, or her father, something handed down. Then how is it here? He did not answer because the answer stood between us already. She had come back, or someone before her had. Not just with warning and tobacco and vague stories folded into kitchen talk. With intent. With materials. With the knowledge that this exact place and this exact break in the line had to be handled physically, not just respected in theory. Somebody in our family had stood where we were kneeling and tried to mend what had been moved. They had buried the sign, or reset it, or left it half-finished. And then, for whatever reason, fear, interruption, a husband who mocked, years that got hard, children to feed, illness, death, they had not completed it. We dug a little farther and found a thin strip of metal beneath the stake, bent but not broken, with 2 names scratched into it by hand. One was my grandmother's family surname before marriage. The other had weathered almost away, but enough remained to make out an initial matching the missing boy Uncle Dad had told me about. Not a ritual object, not a charm from some movie version of the world, a family tag, a record, a claim or apology. I could not tell which. The realization landed so hard I had to sit back on my heels. This wasn't random, I said. Dad laughed once, bleak and low. No, they knew. He nodded. Yeah, they tried to fix it, or started to, and then left it buried. He looked down at the crumbling stake in his hand, or somebody else buried it after. That thought passed between us like a cold wire. Maybe my grandmother had come and set it back. Maybe my grandfather, hating what he did not understand, had ripped it out a second time. Maybe the family's whole history with that land was nothing more than one generation trying to warn and mend, while another generation kept choosing ownership over obedience. I could not prove any of it. I did not need to. The evidence was in my hands, in the old wood, the black stones, the cloth, the metal tag with our name on it lying under years of disregard, as if the land had waited patiently for us to stop calling this story by smaller names. The circle was not where people were taken to be consumed. It was where the line had been broken. That changed everything. It made my own missing hours take on a new and uglier meaning. I had not been hunted into a trap. I had been dragged to the damaged center because my father and I were standing on its consequences and still calling them by the wrong words. I had been made to see what our family had failed to finish. Dad had been pressured and corrected and frightened, not because the place desired him in some simple predatory sense, but because he had poured a house over a wound and called it a legacy. He sat down then, really sat, hard enough on the cold forest floor that I worried for a second about his chest. But he only looked tired beyond speaking. My mother knew, he said after a long silence. Enough to come back. Enough to leave that note. Enough to understand the sign mattered more than the dream did. I closed my hand around the little metal tag, feeling the ridged edge bite gently into my palm. And you forgot. He gave me a glance that was not defensive, only honest. I think I wanted to. That was maybe the first completely unforgiving truth either of us had spoken without trying to soften it. The clearing stood silent around us while we gathered the pieces onto the folded map tube and wrapped them carefully in the dish towel. The pressure in the air did not lift, but it changed as soon as we stopped digging. Less accusation, more waiting. A dangerous distinction, maybe. Or maybe the first real sign that the place had always been less interested in punishing us than in forcing us to come to the part of the story no one in our family had wanted to finish. When we finally stood to leave, I looked once more at the center of the circle and understood something that made my mouth go dry. We had found the marker. We had found proof our family knew. We had found the broken edge of the old repair, but we had not yet fixed anything. This had only been the unlocking. The woods had shown us the wound. Now they were waiting to see whether we would put our hands in it on purpose and mend what our name had helped bury. Dad must have had the same thought because as we stepped back from the clearing, he said, almost to himself, "This is why it kept returning things." I looked at him. He nodded toward the towel bundle in my hands. It wasn't taking. It was teaching us how to bring things back. We left the circle then, moving carefully, the same way we had entered. Only now the path through the woods felt different. No easier. Just legible in a deeper way. Black sand, wet stones, bent branches. Low cloth, all of it less like threat now, and more like the grammar of a place that had been forced to improvise after the original sign went missing. By the time the cabin roofline reappeared through the trees, the afternoon light had turned thin and wintry. My arms ached from carrying the tools and the towel bundle. Dad walked slower than before, every step measured, but he did not stop. The house waited in the clearing with its pale siding and good windows and porch rails built from love and ignorance and debt. For the first time since it had been finished, I looked at it and did not feel only fear. I felt shame. Not because we had built it, because we had built it on top of an answer somebody in our family had once already understood and then chosen to bury. That was the twist at the center of everything. Not that the land was haunted, not that a thing in the woods hated us, not even that my grandmother had known more than she had said. It was that the circle had never been a killing place. It was a damaged boundary, and my family had stood at that damage before, recognized it, begun to repair it, and then left it in the ground for us to pretend over until the land ran out of patience and started teaching the lesson directly through our bodies. Chapter 4. The night we gave it back. We knew before sunset that we would have to go out again in the dark. That was not superstition. It was not because old stories are always improved by twilight, or because fear makes people assign meaning to the hour when the world changes color. It was because everything we had seen that day had the shape of a threshold. The circle itself had felt like a hinge. The line had been broken there. The marker had been buried there. The house sat over the absence of it like a sentence built on a lie. If we were going to put anything back, it had to happen at the edge of one state becoming another. Day into night, house into woods, ownership into apology. By late afternoon, the light over the pond had gone thin and metallic. Dad stood at the kitchen counter with the old dish towel unfolded in front of him, laying things out with a care that made the whole process feel less like preparation and more like witness. Not ritual in the cinematic sense. No candles, no books in strange alphabets, no brave speeches to keep panic away. Just an old man with a tremor in his left hand setting out the pieces his family should never have removed from the land in the first place. The cedar stake we had cut in the motel parking lot, the rotted remains of the old stake wrapped now in wax paper, because even decay had weight once it belonged to meaning. The black stones from the buried marker, the little bent family tag with the worn initial, the strip of cloth we had bought in town, faded with tea and dirt until it no longer looked new enough to insult the place. The note from my grandmother inside its plastic bag, and the mason jar. I set that down last. The black stone inside gleamed darker than it should have in the yellow kitchen light, and the sand at the bottom still looked faintly damp despite the dry air in the cabin. I had expected, by then, for the jar to have done something more theatrical, to crack, to fog, to rattle against the counter when the sun went down. Instead, it sat there with the quiet menace of a thing that no longer needed to prove itself. Dad looked at it for a long time before he touched the lid. If it kept returning them, he said, not looking at me, then they were never ours. That was the first sentence either of us had spoken in nearly 10 minutes. The cabin had gone so still around us that even the compressor hum from the mini-split sounded too large. I stood with my hands flat on the table, watching him unscrew the lid of the jar one careful turn at a time, as if speed mattered. The smell that rose from it was faint but immediate. Wet leaf rot, pond mud, that old underground dampness we had learned too well. He did not flinch. He only set the lid down and stepped back. Beside the jar, he laid out his cigarettes, not the whole carton. 3 full cigarettes, chosen one by one, then broken open with his thumbnail so the tobacco sat loose in a small mound on the towel. He had been carrying that carton like medicine for months. I had seen him touch it in parking lots, hospital rooms, motels, and at the edge of our own porch. I had seen him pour the tobacco into the dirt like a tax paid to pass. but I had never seen him put all of it in one place at once with this expression on his face. Not fear, not exactly. Grief, maybe. Or the look a person gets when they finally understand that a thing they called tradition was only the shadow of an apology they should have made openly a long time ago. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out one more object I had not seen since we left Miss Lena's porch. A strip of cloth, older than the one we bought. Brittle at the folds and faded to a color that might once have been deep red. It had been kept flat for years in something book-like because it held the faint memory of creases. For a second, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then he put it next to the old photograph, and I saw it. Same width, same frayed end, same low knot pattern. "You had that the whole time?" I asked. His mouth tightened. "My mother gave it to me when I was 12, and you never said anything." He gave me a long, level look. That sentence applies to both of us now. I shut my mouth. He was right. He had hidden family truth in a blueprint tube and a jacket pocket. I had hidden a sweating stone in a mason jar under my clothes. We had both been living like men who believed withholding evidence gave us control over it. The woods had cured us of that, if nothing else. Outside, the last of the daylight drained through the pond-facing windows. The clearing beyond the glass took on that in-between quality that had become its own kind of warning. Not dark yet, not safe anymore. Just stripped of ordinary depth so that every tree looked flatter and farther than it was. Dad folded the old note from my grandmother and slid it back into his jacket. Then he wrapped the stake, cloth, stones, metal tag, and tobacco into the towel in a way that made them look less like tools than remains. I lifted the jar. He took the towel bundle. Neither of us said it, but the understanding sat there between us as clear as a spoken line. What we were carrying out of that kitchen was not gear. It was family failure made physical. We waited until the first real edge of twilight. Not because we enjoyed it, because both of us had felt the weight of timing by then. Too early, and the place remained in the flat language of day, where denial still had room to breathe. Too late, and the woods took too much of the world back into themselves for men to move honestly through them. The hour we chose was narrow, a sliver. The moment when windows begin to turn into mirrors and birds stop one by one and the first cold comes up from the ground instead of down from the sky. At exactly that hour, the cabin resisted us. I know how that sounds. If I had heard it from someone else before that summer, I would have translated it into plumbing problems, bad wiring, weather pressure, psychological contagion, and any one of those explanations could cover a small part of what happened if you wanted them badly enough. But wanting the smaller explanation is a luxury that disappears after enough repetitions. I had just reached for my flashlight by the back door when the overhead kitchen light flickered once, twice, then steadied. The mini split cut out and restarted with a hard, metallic click. Somewhere in the wall to our left came a sound so familiar my body recognized it before my mind did. 3 taps, not loud, not dramatic, knuckle on wood patient, tuck, tuck, tuck. From inside the wall cavity near the staircase, my whole body went still. Dad did not look toward the sound immediately. That was the change in him. The old version of my father would have reacted first and understood later. This version understood too much to grant every signal the dignity of panic. He only closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them and looked at the back door. The light flickered again. Then the wet line appeared, not creeping from under the sink or along the floorboards like in the motel, This one showed itself slowly, like ink pulled through wood grain by a hidden hand. It began at the threshold of the back door and traced inward over the pine boards in one narrow, dark seam no wider than a finger, arrowing toward the middle of the living room where the cabin's interior met the space above the buried line. It stopped there, not random, not spill, a drawn connection between outside and in. The smell came with it, pond water, damp rot, deep earth. Behind us, from somewhere inside the wall near the downstairs bedroom, came another 3 taps. Dad whispered, "It knows." I did not need him to explain what he meant. Not that it knew we were here. That had never been in question. It knew what we were about to do. The back door would not open on the first try. I turned the deadbolt, heard the mechanism release, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It moved an inch and stopped hard, not caught on the frame, not swollen from weather, just held. The sort of resistance a person might apply from the other side if they wanted you to understand you were not leaving cleanly. My mouth went dry so fast it hurt. I pulled again. Nothing. A soft, wet drag sounded from the siding outside, slow, descending. The exact same texture of sound I had heard that night on the porch while the shape stood at the tree line. It moved down the exterior wall in one deliberate stroke, and then ceased. The cabin was not merely containing the wrongness anymore. It had become part of the mechanism. The place had used the house as another room to teach in, another surface to write on, another structure through which boundaries could be translated into behavior. Every drag mark, every flicker, every pressure pulse in the hallway had been the same lesson repeated inside timber and insulation, because we had dragged the violated line into domestic space and called that improvement. I let go of the handle and stepped back. For 1 second, I hated the cabin. Not abstractly, not as symbol. I hated the wall studs, the windows Dad had framed by hand, the porch boards Nate and Parker and Luis had helped us set, the trim cuts, the wiring, the smooth pine floor that had once swallowed a wet seam until no proof remained. I hated that we had made something beautiful on top of an injury, and then acted shocked when the beauty learned the language of the wound underneath it. Dad looked around the room like he was seeing exactly that for the first time too. His voice, when it came, was rough and low and more honest than anything he had said all summer. "If it wants the line back," he said, "then this house was never innocent." The sentence changed the room, not magically, not like a spell breaking, but the resistance in the handle loosened. I felt it before I tested it because the pressure in the cabin shifted a fraction, enough for my ears to clear. Dad stepped closer to the threshold, carrying the wrapped marker pieces in both hands like a burden that had finally reached the correct door. He looked at the floor, at the dark seam stretching inward, and then out through the half-reflective glass toward the deepening woods. "I built over it," he said into the room itself. "I know that now." The wall behind us gave one last soft knock, then silence. I reached for the handle again. This time the door opened. Cold evening air moved in at once, taking some of the damp smell with it, though not all. The wet line on the floor remained. The lights steadied. We stepped onto the porch with the sense not of escape, but of having cleared the first gate in a process far older than our language for it. The clearing looked wrong in that hour the way all thresholds do. Not dark enough to hide in, not bright enough to trust. The cabin behind us hummed low and domestic, but less confidently now, as if it understood it had just been included in the indictment. We did not look back as we crossed the yard. No black sand path showed on the ground tonight. We no longer needed it. We had the route in our bodies by then, trained there by fear, corrected by repetition, and finally held together by purpose. The woods opened for us in the same narrow way they had earlier, but now every trunk and gap and hanging bough felt charged by the knowledge of what we carried, not chased, witnessed. The pressure increased with every yard. Not enough to stop movement, enough to make movement matter. By the time the circle appeared between the trees, full dark had settled. The clearing was not invisible. It was worse. It held its own version of light, a flattened pallor that made the open ground look colder than the forest around it. The ring of trunks stood like judges. No fog rolled there, but the air inside the clearing looked denser, as if darkness had weight in that place instead of mere absence. We stopped at the edge together. This time there was no question of me being lured in ahead of him. The figure was already there. It stood just inside the trees opposite us, half in the gap between two trunks, higher than the brush line, too vertical to be mistaken for anything living according to normal scale. In the first fraction of a second, my mind still tried to fit it into the old misreading hoodie, person, trespasser, human silhouette as lure. But now, after everything, I could feel the falseness of that translation almost before my eyes completed it. The hood, or what my brain insisted on reading as a hood, was only the nearest shape my vision could cling to. The drape of fabric, the suggestion of shoulders, the impression of sleeves. All of it was just enough to keep me from seeing the proportions underneath clearly. Too tall, too narrow in one place and too elongated in another. Jointed wrong without seeming broken. Human only in the way a dead tree sometimes resembles a reaching person if you catch it at dusk. It did not move toward us. It did not beckon. It only stood there, watching. And because it no longer needed to lure me, the urge to stare directly into where its face should have been came on me so strongly it felt like vertigo. I wanted the answer in the most primitive possible way. I wanted to rip the hood shape away with my eyes and force reality to admit the exact contour of what had been rearranging our lives all summer. Dad caught the back of my sleeve without looking at me. "Don't," he said. The word was barely air. I obeyed. We stepped into the clearing together. The pressure closed over us at once, not as violent as the first time I crossed into the circle alone, when the air had become deep water and my body had lost itself to lag and numbness. This was heavier than that in one sense, and kinder in another. Heavier because I knew what I was feeling now and could not insult it with simpler explanations. Kinder because it did not try to separate me from myself. My ears rang, my chest tightened. The metallic taste touched the back of my tongue like a warning, then held there without worsening. The figure stayed where it was. I could feel its attention the same way you can feel the angle of somebody else's eyes in a room even before you look. Dad knelt first. The motion cost him. I saw it in the careful way he lowered himself, in the tightening around his mouth, in the way his left hand shook once hard before he steadied it against his thigh. But he knelt. That was what mattered. Not a patriarch, not a builder, not an owner. A man in the dirt at the edge of a line his family had damaged. I knelt beside him. We unwrapped the towel bundle on the clearing floor. Old stake, new cedar stake, black stones, the metal tag, the cloth from my grandmother's keeping, the cloth we had brought to replace what time had ruined, the opened cigarettes, the jar. Under the pressure of the air, The objects looked almost absurdly simple. Wood, fabric, stone, metal, tobacco. The language of poor people, of practical people, of family members who fix things with what they already have because the world rarely hands them cleaner materials. Dad set the rotted wood down first at the place where the center depression felt aligned with the broken pattern around it. Not the exact middle, but the edge of relation. The new cedar stake went beside it, not replacing, but continuing. He pressed the old black stones in at the base with fingers that left crescents in the damp earth. I tied the cloth low, as in the photograph, not decorative, not high enough to catch the eye from a distance, only enough to mark this place to those already close enough to need warning. The family tag we laid beneath the stones, not displayed, returned when it was time for the jar. I hesitated. It had lived too long as proof inside my mind. Even now, some rotten, defensive part of me wanted to keep a little of it back. A pinch of sand. The stone itself. Something to preserve the reality of what happened in a form no future version of me could explain away. Dad did not look at me, but he knew. "If you keep any," he said quietly, "you're keeping the lesson wrong." I unscrewed the lid. The smell rose stronger now than it ever had in the cabin. Wet leaves, deep mud, something mineral and old. The stone slid into my palm cold, as if it had been sunk in winter water. I placed it among the other black stones, and for a fraction of a second, the pressure in the clearing sharpened. Not painfully, but distinctly, like a held breath. Then I tipped the jar and poured the sand into the earth at the foot of the stake. It fell in one dark stream and vanished almost immediately into the soil, as though the ground accepted it without comment. Dad scattered the tobacco around the base with 2 fingers. Then he sat back on his heels and looked straight ahead, not at the figure. Not at me, but at the line of trees where darkness and watching met. When he spoke, his voice was unlike any I had heard from him before. No fake strength, no old man authority, no ritual drama borrowed from movies or sermons. Just truth stripped of performance. "I took down something that wasn't mine," he said. "I thought if I built enough over it, I could make it mine. I thought paper and boards and my own hands mattered more than what was already here." The clearing held still around us. He swallowed and went on. "I'm sorry for that." The words sounded small in the open air, which made them feel more real. "I'm sorry for pulling up a sign I didn't understand. I'm sorry for building over a boundary and calling it a home. I'm sorry for making a place that should have been crossed carefully into something I claimed." His left hand was shaking badly now. I could hear the strain in his breathing. He did not stop. "You gave things back to us because we were supposed to bring them here ourselves. I know that now." He paused. I know it wasn't hate. It was correction. The figure in the trees did not move. I wanted to look at it and did not. Dad's voice dropped even lower. "What belongs to my family, I'll take responsibility for. What doesn't, I leave. Just let my boy go from what followed him. Let the part that stayed with him stay here if this is where it belongs." That almost broke me. Not because it was poetic, because it was my father giving up the last, ugliest thread of himself, the belief that he could negotiate everything in terms of what he personally deserved. He was not asking to win, not asking to keep the cabin as prize, not asking to walk away unmarked. He was admitting, fully, that he had confused possession with permission and nearly handed me the cost of that confusion as inheritance. I heard myself speaking before I decided to. "We brought back what we found." I said into the same cold quiet. If there's more, show us in a way that doesn't take us apart. Dad's head turned slightly, but he did not stop me. That mattered too. For one stretched second, nothing changed. Then the figure moved, not with a leap, not with a cinematic jerk. It simply took one step forward out of the trees and into the thinning edge of the clearing. The change in scale made my stomach drop. It had been too tall at the tree line. Closer. The wrongness became harder to forgive with human language. The hood shape remained, because my eyes needed it to remain. But beneath it, the body did not reconcile. The head sat too high over the shoulders. The shoulders sloped wrong. The arms seemed longer, not in a freak show way, but in the way of geometry translated badly into flesh. The fabric or bark or shadow or whatever substance my mind insisted on clothing it with hung in planes that suggested length where there should have been bulk and joints where there should have been smooth motion. I kept my eyes below where the face should be. Instinct screamed to look. Every nerve in me wanted the reveal, the certainty, the final proof that terror can be pinned to features. Dad's grip tightened on my sleeve, hard enough to hurt. That pain helped. I did not look higher. The pressure in the clearing deepened for one terrible instant as the figure reached the marker. Not the crushing paralysis of the first time, a density, a closeness, the sort of change in air that makes the body understand attention before the mind does. I braced for the metallic taste to flood full into my mouth, for the numbness to climb my hands, for the old dragging sensation that had once taken my time away to seize hold of me again. It did not. Instead, the pressure shifted the moment Dad's apology finished echoing in the trees. The ringing in my ears began to fade, not all at once, gradually, like water draining from a sink. The metallic taste thinned. The awful, invisible hook I had been half expecting to feel somewhere behind my ribs, the old lure. The command to move forward against my will. The sense of being slightly out of phase with my own body did not come. The figure bent, not much. Just enough that one too long arm or sleeve or branch-like limb passed near the new marker. I could not tell whether it touched the cloth or the stone or simply hovered over them. Because the act of not looking directly where I most wanted to look had become its own kind of physical labor. But I heard a small sound then, softer than a footstep. Not a growl, not breath, more like damp fabric settling over wood. Then the pressure eased again, not gone, accepted. That was the only word I have for it, and even now I dislike how much interpretation it carries. But there is no cleaner one. The air around the circle lost the tight scrutiny it had held over us all summer. The figure straightened, not threatening, not satisfied either, merely no longer poised toward correction. And in that moment I felt, with a force that nearly emptied my lungs, that this thing had never been some random hunter wandering the woods in search of the unlucky. It had no interest in us, until we made ourselves the damaged edge of the line. What it guarded was not prey. It guarded relation, crossing, proportion, the place where one side of the world got too close to another and required memory to keep them from erasing each other. My father had not been wrong to feel watched. He had been wrong to think being watched meant being hated. The figure took one step backward, then another. It did not disappear theatrically. It retreated in the same deliberate way it had once lured me, except now there was no invitation in it, no hook, just withdrawal, a return to the place of holding. The cloth at the stake lifted once in a wind that had not yet reached us. and then the woods began to breathe again. That is the simplest way I know to say it. A thread of wind moved through the upper branches from left to right. Not a gust. Real weather. Needles whispered overhead. From somewhere beyond the clearing came the first tentative chirr of an insect. Then another. The dead silence that had sealed the circle all evening loosened and split. The smell of pond rot receded, as if carried away on colder air from somewhere farther uphill. My ears cleared completely. I looked down at my watch without meaning to. The hands sat exactly where they should, not slipped, not lagged, not spun by panic into nonsense. Time had stayed with me, beside me. Dad's breathing slowed. I glanced at his hands and felt an absurd, sudden tightness in my throat. For the first time in longer than I could remember. His left hand was not visibly trembling, not perfectly still, not miraculously cured, but quiet enough that the motion did not draw the eye. He saw me looking and gave one exhausted, disbelieving huff through his nose. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. When we finally stood, it was clumsy and unceremonious and human. My knees popped. Dad braced with one hand on his thigh. The night did not collapse around us for moving. The circle remained what it was, not a trap, not a threat, but a place in better order than when we entered. We backed away instead of turning our backs immediately, not from terror, from respect learned late. The figure did not reappear. The stake stood with its low cloth and dark stones and family tag beneath them. The tobacco scent mixed with ordinary cold dirt. By the time we reached the cabin clearing again, the stars had come out thinly above the trees. The porch light glowed steady, no flicker, no wet drag down the siding. The house looked smaller somehow, as if the night had corrected its importance. At the bottom of the steps, we stopped. There, on the threshold just outside the back door, lay a single dry stone. Not black and wet like the others, not gleaming, not cold-looking. Just a smooth, pale river stone no bigger than a walnut, set exactly in the center of the sill where nothing could mistake it for accident. Beside it, folded once, was a narrow strip of clean cloth. Not new, not old, but plain and dry. Dad looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us touched them right away, because we both understood, in the same instant, what the little arrangement was. Not a threat, not a warning, a receipt. Only this time not the kind the woods had been issuing all summer when it returned our objects to remind us they had never belonged to us at all. This was quieter than that, final in a different way. The kind of acknowledgement one side leaves when a transaction has ended and no further argument is required. Dad crouched slowly and picked up the pale stone. It stayed dry in his hand. No smell of pond water came with it. No dark residue marked his palm. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was grief in it too. Then he handed the stone to me. And for the first time since we had stepped onto that land months earlier, I held something from the woods that did not feel like it wanted to keep any part of me with it. Chapter 5. The first morning, it didn't feel like we were being watched. We went back into the cabin slowly, like men entering a hospital room after the machines have gone quiet. Not because we expected something terrible, because after a certain kind of fear, peace feels suspicious. Dad opened the door first. I stayed half a step behind him, pale stone still in my hand. The clean strip of cloth tucked into my jacket pocket like I did not quite trust putting it down yet. Warm light from the kitchen spilled across the porch boards in a square the color of old honey. The house smelled of pine, dust, and the faint leftover heat from the mini-split. Nothing else. No pond rot, no damp earth. No old water basement smell folding itself out of impossible corners. We stood in the doorway longer than we needed to. The back threshold where the wet line had once drawn itself inward was dry. The floorboards looked exactly like floorboards. Pine grain, knots, little scuffs from boots and dropped tools and living. The overhead light held steady without the slightest pulse. No dimming, no electrical hesitation, no subtle, insulting flicker that made every room feel like it was breathing around us. Dad stepped inside first. I watched him do it the way I had watched him all summer, without meaning to, without wanting to. In that constant low vigilance, fear teaches you when you love someone whose body has already failed once in front of you. He put his weight on one foot, then the other. He paused, listening. Nothing answered. Not from the walls, not from the hallway, not from the bedroom where the pressure had once lived like a second atmosphere. The house settled once with a small, ordinary click somewhere in the woodwork, and that was all. Dad turned halfway toward me, and his face had changed in a way I had no language for at first. It was not happiness. It was not relief either. Not in the quick, bright way people use that word. It was something more fragile than both. The expression of a man who has spent so long bracing for impact that the absence of it feels like standing on a leg that has gone numb and trying to trust it not to collapse. I came in and shut the door. The lock clicked. This time it sounded like hardware, just metal seeding into metal. Not a defensive gesture, not a prayer disguised as routine. A lock in a cabin in the woods. We did not talk much after that. There was no speech big enough to fit the shape of what had happened. And neither of us was built for the kind of emotional sweeping people expect at the end of a story. We moved through the rooms quietly, not checking for signs the way we had before, but unable not to notice their absence. The wall by the porch where I had heard the wet drag on the siding was clean and dry. The hallway held no pressure seam in the air. The downstairs bedroom looked like a room, not a place someone might lie awake in and smell old water collecting behind the walls. Even the bathroom, which I had come to distrust almost as much as the woods, offered only soap, dry tile, and the faint institutional smell of motel-sized detergent packets we had left under the sink weeks earlier. Dad washed his hands at the kitchen faucet and stood there with the water running half a second longer than necessary. Then he shut it off and stared at his own wet hands under the light. I thought he was checking for tremor. Maybe he was. But when he looked up at me, he only said, "No smell." That was how far we had come. That sentence, in another year of our lives, would have meant nothing. There, in that kitchen, with the black line finally put back into the earth and the woods no longer pressing against the house like a second structure, it was nearly enough to make my throat close. We did one more lap of the cabin before trying to sleep. No drag marks, no dark seams in the wood, no black sand in the corners. No polite 3 taps from inside a wall where no human hand should be. No restless pulse in the lights. No hidden dampness under the newness of the place. Only the silence. And that was the strangest thing of all. Because silence had been the wood's sharpest tool for so long that I had forgotten it belonged to ordinary life too. There is a silence of dread. The kind that feels padded and intentional, as if all living things have been told at once to stop and listen. and there is the silence of a normal house at night. A silence made of systems resting, of walls holding warmth, of nobody currently speaking in a small structure far from town. This was the second kind. It took me a long time to believe that. I lay in the loft on the thin mattress I had once hated and stared up at the ceiling beams until my eyes burned. Every creak of the house settling made me tense at first, not because it sounded wrong, but because it sounded so deeply right that I could not trust it. I listened for the pressure shift in the hallway, for the wet sound on the porch boards, for the wall knock that had once moved through studs and new timber, as if the whole cabin were only a skin stretched over somebody else's patience. Nothing came. No electrical flicker glowed under the loft rail. No smell rose through the floor. No sound from the pond translated itself into warning. Below me, Dad turned once in bed. That was all. No waking footsteps. No soft muttering in fragments of his mother's language. No chair creak from the kitchen table in the middle of the night, while he sat in low, orange darkness, trying to ask permission from something he did not fully know how to name. At some point, I realized I had been lying still for almost an hour. Not because I could not sleep, because I was waiting for the cabin to reveal that the whole thing had only changed shape again. It never did. When sleep finally came, it did not feel like surrender. It felt like falling into an ordinary dark. That may sound like a small thing. It was not. There are kinds of rest that only happen when your body stops standing watch against a world your mind cannot control. I had not had that kind of sleep since before the first missing nail gun. Maybe before the first night in the frame when the world went too quiet and a single knock sounded where no wall should have been. I woke once around what must have been 3 a.m. and did not know why. That had become its own category of terror for me. Sudden waking without cause. I lay there for one hard second, waiting for my heart to outrun itself, waiting for the pressure to form in the air before my thoughts caught up, waiting for some soft drag or wet breath or patient knock to explain the alarm. There was nothing. Only darkness. Only the soft, dry hum of climate control. Only the almost imperceptible sound of my father sleeping downstairs like an old man in a house he had once dreamed of for decades and nearly destroyed by trying to force it into the wrong shape. I turned over and went back to sleep. That was the first real proof. Not that the thing was gone. I do not talk about it like that. Gone suggests something defeated, expelled, banished, pushed out of a territory by human effort. That is not what happened, and it would be dishonest to tell it that way. What changed was not the existence of whatever held that place. What changed was the relation. The house no longer felt like a room where we were being corrected. It felt like a house. Morning came through the pond-facing windows in a way I still struggle to describe without sounding sentimental. Not brighter, exactly, just cleaner. The light did not have that strained, washed-out quality I had come to associate with the property, where every sunrise seemed temporary and every reflection on water felt 1 degree too dark beneath itself. This light was pale gold and dry. It landed on the floorboards in long, clear rectangles and stayed there without making the room look like a trap disguised as warmth. I came down the loft ladder and found Dad already in the kitchen. Coffee was brewing. Bacon was in the skillet, fat beginning to spit around the edges. The sound of it was so aggressively domestic that I had to stop at the bottom rung and just stand there for a second. A pan on a stove, grease popping, morning light on a counter. There is something almost obscene about seeing ordinary life arrive intact after you have spent so long preparing yourself to lose it? Dad looked over his shoulder. He had slept in his clothes, which was still a habit he had not fully broken in that place. But his face looked different. Not younger, not miraculously repaired. The lines around his eyes and mouth were still there. The tremor was still part of him. The summer had not been erased from his body, but some small tightening had gone out of him. Some interior clench he had worn for months without ever admitting it. "Morning," he said. The word hit me with an almost stupid force, not because of the greeting, because it sounded normal. I managed something back that might have been morning, or maybe just air. The cabin smelled of coffee, bacon, and pine warmed gently by first light. No wetness under it, no hidden drain breath, no moldy, cold sweetness, turning every domestic thing uncanny. I crossed to the back door and crouched automatically to look at the threshold. Dry. No line. No dark seam pulled through the grain by some unseen hand. The little pale stone from the night before sat on the windowsill above the sink, where Dad had apparently placed it while I was upstairs. It looked like what it was now, a stone, smooth, quiet. Not a warning, I opened the door. Morning air came in cold and harmless. Real cold. Not the charged, damp chill that had so often announced pressure. I stepped onto the porch and looked at the boards. No drag marks, no dew gathered into impossible threads, no stains that would later vanish into wood before I could prove to myself they had been there. The clearing beyond was still and bright. The pond lay dark blue under low sun, not black. A breeze moved lightly through the nearest pines, somewhere off to the left. Birds were bickering over something birds probably argue about every morning in every stand of trees that humans have not yet made into symbols. I laughed once under my breath, just from relief and embarrassment at how close to tears the bird noise got me. Then I went back inside and started checking. Not compulsively, deliberately. This was for proof, and I knew it. Some hard, practical part of me needed to move through every place that had once carried its own distortion and confirm the lack of it. Not because I distrusted what we had done, but because this story would never remain whole in my mind if I did not witness the ordinary with the same care I had once given the impossible. The tool bin in the closet was clean. No black sand packed into the seam at the bottom. No glistening stone in a corner. No quiet rearrangement of tools into unnaturally careful order. Just tools. A tape measure, drill, impact driver, a box of screws, the original nail gun and the replacement, one side by side. No longer accusatory. Only expensive and real and very human in the way their weight sat in my hands. The bathroom mirror stayed clear after I ran hot water. I did that on purpose. Turned the faucet all the way toward heat and stood there like an idiot waiting for the old impossible pattern to assert itself. Steam rose. The mirror fogged the way bathroom mirrors fog in ordinary life, from top to bottom, softly, evenly. No narrow bead of moisture drawing itself into meaning. No old water smell out of the drain. When I wiped a line through the condensation with my finger, it behaved like condensation and nothing else. The hallway remained just a hallway. No thickness of air, no tiny pressure seam at the back bedroom door. I took my phone out and opened the camera app. That was another thing I needed. I stood in the middle of the living room and filmed the pond through the windows, the porch rail, the line of trees beyond the clearing, the hallway, the kitchen table. the floorboards where the wet drag had once vanished into the grain. The image held. Focus worked. The video did not pulse or swallow itself or refuse the woods the way it had that night on the porch when I tried to capture the shape at the edge of the light. I stopped recording and watched it back immediately. What I saw on the screen was the same thing my eyes had seen in the room. A cabin. Morning. Bright boards. Steam haze from the kitchen. My father at the stove turning bacon with a fork like he had every right in the world to be there, and had finally learned why that right was never simple. That was the proof people always want in stories like this. Not blood on the wall, not a body, not some frozen frame with red circles drawn around a blur at the tree line. Proof that reality held. Proof that whatever had been bent had unbent. I filmed the bathroom drain too, just to be ridiculous about it. And the only thing that came through the microphone was bacon crackling and my father saying, from the kitchen, "You know you look insane, right?" It was the first joke he had made in weeks that did not feel forced. I grinned in spite of myself. "Documenting evidence?" I said, of what I looked around the cabin at the sunlight, the dry air, the quiet floor, the normal weight of the room. Absence. I said. He made a low sound that might have been a laugh. We ate breakfast at the little table by the pond-facing window. Nothing gourmet, bacon, eggs, toast fried too dark on one side because the pan heat was uneven, and Dad still refused to admit it needed replacing. We ate like men who had just done heavy labor, though the only thing I had lifted since waking was the tool bin lid. Hunger had come back in the night, and it felt almost humiliating to realize how long fear had been taking that from me too. Dad poured more coffee for both of us. Steam lifted from the mugs in pale ribbons. For a while, we just listened to the small sounds of the cabin proving itself. Fork against plate. The tick of the stove cooling after he turned the burner off. Wind brushing once against the porch screen. The ordinary world had texture again, and I was almost afraid to speak into it too hard. Dad broke the silence first. "Your grandmother wasn't crazy." The sentence was so direct and so deeply not his usual way of entering a subject that I looked up at him immediately. He had his mug in both hands, not hiding the tremor now, not pretending it wasn't there. It was faint, but visible again after those few near-still minutes the night before. The difference was that he was not ashamed of my seeing it. "I know," I said. He shook his head. "No. I mean, I knew that too. Somewhere. But I spent most of my life translating her into something easier to live with. Superstitious, old country, worn down by hard years. Easier than admitting she understood a kind of reality I didn't want attached to me." He looked out the window at the pond. She wasn't trying to frighten me as a boy. She was trying to stop me from inheriting the wrong part of my father. I waited. He took a sip of coffee and winced because it was too hot. That little stupid reaction nearly undid me. Even now, remembering it, I know why. There was something so purely human about it. After all the pressure and silence and drag marks and impossible returns, here was my father burning his tongue on coffee and making the same annoyed face he made at every diner and motel breakfast, since I had been old enough to notice him as a person separate from me. He set the mug down carefully. My mother told stories because stories were the only way she could get truth into a house where truth got mocked if it wore the wrong clothes. His eyes stayed on the table as he spoke. My father wanted clean ownership, deeds, lines, fence posts. Men love that kind of certainty when they feel small anywhere else. She understood something messier, that a place can be yours on paper and still not belong to you in the way your body wants to claim it. You were trying to prove something, I said gently. He laughed once, quietly, with no humor in it. Yeah, he did not deny it. That stroke scared the hell out of me, he said. Not just because of dying, because of helplessness, because of time. Because all of a sudden my own hand didn't answer me the way it used to. My chest, my head, my balance, none of it was clean anymore. And then there was that land sitting out there in my mind like unfinished business, a thing I had promised myself years before I ever promised it to anybody else. He rubbed his thumb along the handle of the mug. I thought if I could get the cabin built, I'd prove something. That I still had enough force left in me to shape the world instead of just react to what it took away. He gave me a long look then, one that did not spare him at all. I kept trying to prove I wasn't afraid and almost made you pay for it. The words were simple. That made them unbearable. He did not reach across the table dramatically. He did not cry. He did not suddenly become a different man than the one who had raised me. He only sat there, tired and older than I had ever known him, and let the sentence stay where it landed. I looked down at my plate because my eyes had gone hot. After a moment, I said, "You should have listened sooner." "I know," he said, not defensive, not wounded, just true. Then, after a beat, more quietly, "I should have listened sooner." The line between apology and confession is thin. In that moment, he crossed it without ceremony. It was enough. We sat with that for a while. The cabin held it. That may be one of the strangest things to say about a building, but it is the best language I have. The house that had once translated pressure into behavior now seemed able to contain grief without turning it into threat. Our voices did not drop halfway through sentences. The walls did not absorb confession and return it as warning. We could speak and remain only men at a table in morning light. Eventually, practical questions returned. Because practical questions are how people like us walk back out of revelation without pretending it did not happen. "What do we do with the cabin?" I asked. Dad leaned back in his chair and looked around the room, as if seeing it again through the right set of terms for the first time. Not conquerors' terms. Not dreamers either, something closer to stewardship. Though even that word feels too tidy for what we meant. "We don't burn it," he said. That almost made me laugh. The idea had lived somewhere in me all along. Dramatic and stupid and clean. Fire as moral clarity. Burn the wrong thing down and call that justice. It is the kind of impulse stories train into us because destruction looks decisive from the outside. Dad shook his head before I could say anything. "No," he said. "That would just be another version of thinking force solves all of it. We don't sell it either." He was quiet for a second. Not fast. Not out of panic. And not while pretending nothing happened. That was the answer I had not been able to form on my own. Because I did not want the dream obliterated. Not after what it had cost him. Not after what it had nearly cost us. But I could not bear the thought of simply keeping it as is. As if we had returned one marker in the circle, and therefore the whole house had been absolved of its location and history. Dad seemed to read that in my face. "We changed the way it sits," he said. "Not all of it. We move what needs moving. We leave the line clear. We stop acting like the whole clearing is ours just because the deed says so." That became our decision before lunch. We would keep the cabin. but not as trophy, not as proof, not as an act of possession sharpened into nostalgia. We would shorten part of the path that crossed too close to where the old line had run. We would move the side of the porch that drifted nearest the marked relation and leave that edge of the clearing open. We would reset a proper marker at the boundary the right way, not hidden, not decorative, not turned into some tourist version of mystery. Just a sign where a sign belonged. Low cloth, stones, space, respect. The cabin would remain, but its grammar would change. That mattered more than its footprint. We spent the rest of that day making notes. No heavy work, no grand renovation in a burst of righteous energy. Just careful planning, measuring from the old photographs and the mapped relation between house, pond, and circle. Walking the clearing in daylight and finally allowing ourselves to stand still where our bodies had once insisted on shrinking away. Dad paused once at the edge of the porch and put his palm against the post. Not the way a man claims a structure, but the way he checks whether a tree has survived winter. Still good, he said. It was not clear whether he meant the wood or himself. We locked up just after dark, though without dread now. We drove back to town for the night because habit still had some say in us, and because neither of us felt the need to prove courage by sleeping there again immediately. The motel room looked small and ugly after the cabin, but even there the drain smelled only like drain. The mirror fogged the way mirrors do. Dad slept without muttering. I did too. The next weeks passed in a way that would have made poor viewing for people who think endings should explode. We did the work. That was all. Nate came back with Parker one weekend and Luis another, and this time we told them more, not everything. Not because secrecy was still the rule, but because not every truth survives being handed to men who did not live the shape of it. We told them enough old marker line, wrong build angle, family history, need to shift part of the porch and leave a section of the clearing alone. Nate squinted at the map, asked only one question. "You sure?" And when Dad said yes, he nodded like that was the whole matter. Good men do that sometimes. They understand there are kinds of dignity that do not need explanation to be honored. We moved what needed moving. Part of the side approach came up. A narrow run of porch was rebuilt farther from the old relation. The path was redirected so that entry to the cabin no longer cut the line carelessly. We reset the new marker on the proper side of the clearing, low and plain. No one made a spectacle of it. Dad placed the first stone himself. I tied the cloth. Parker noticed the seriousness of the act and, for once in his life, did not take a photo. We did not leave tobacco every time after that. This part matters. The old habit did not become a permanent tax, and that was how I knew the difference between relationship and fear. Dad still carried the carton for a while, the way a man keeps a crutch nearby after the leg is mostly healed. But he stopped reaching for it automatically. Eventually, it stayed in the truck glove box, then in a kitchen drawer at home, then nowhere I saw again. We were not buying passage anymore. We were remembering how not to cross stupidly. Winter passed, then a season, then another. I did not return alone until late spring, when the pond had gone from black to a cleaner blue, and the ground no longer held the hard memory of frost. Dad wanted to come and then, to my surprise, said maybe this one should be mine. Not because he was afraid, because he understood that some places have to become yours again, in smaller, healthier ways. One honest visit at a time. So I drove out by myself on a mild morning with a cooler in the passenger seat and the windows down. It is strange what the body notices first when dread is gone. Not the big things, the little permissions. How the road could be only rough road again. How the truck cab smelled like coffee and dust and old vinyl instead of impossible damp. How I did not rehearse in the mile before the access trail. What I would do if the radio turned to static or the windshield bloomed from the inside with breath not mine. Nothing happened. I parked in the clearing and cut the engine. The cabin stood as we had left it after the modifications clean. A little simpler, better proportioned to the space around it, now that we had stopped forcing approach lines where they should not be. The windows reflected sky. The porch rails were dry. The marker stood low at its proper place. Not attention-seeking, not eerie, just there. I got out and stood in the morning with my keys in my hand and waited for my body to tell me something was wrong. It did not. The air felt light, not empty, not scrubbed of mystery, not conquered, just uncompressed. The kind of air that lets your lungs expand fully without making you aware they had once been taking in less. I walked first to the marker. Grass had come up thicker around it than in the rest of the clearing, green and healthy, not miraculous, not glowing, not some sentimental sign from a film, just good growth in a place that had once felt held too tightly. The cloth moved faintly in the breeze. A black stone at the base had gone matte with weather. It looked settled. From the trees to my right came a quiet crackle of movement. A deer stepped into view. Young doe, slim-legged. No panic in her. Only the wary ease of a wild thing checking the edge of a human place without finding immediate insult there. She looked at me once, ears angling. Then she crossed the clearing in 3 light steps and disappeared toward the pond. That simple sight nearly undid me more than the piece itself. Because animals had always been my truest measure out there. Silence gone wrong, absence of insects, the pond holding its breath, the way life withdrew before pressure. To see a deer move through the open as if the land and the house had finally reached terms with each other was somehow more convincing than any ghostly proof I had ever craved. I went into the cabin, dry, light, ordinary. I opened the tool bin. Nothing but tools. I ran water in the sink and smelled only clean plumbing and old copper. I stood in the hallway where pressure had once pooled and felt only the mild warmth of a closed room in spring. Then I walked down to the pond. The water lay calm under high light. Not black glass. Not an eye. Just water holding sky. Bugs moved over the surface in tiny, busy patterns. Reeds clicked softly at the edge. I crouched and touched the water with 2 fingers. Cold. Real. No metallic taste filled my mouth. No drag of attention pulled me toward the woods. No wrongness threaded itself through the reflection. That was when the final understanding came. Not as a revelation exactly, but as the thing all the others had been trying to become. The most horrifying part of that whole summer had never been the shape in the woods. Not really. It had not been the impossible distances or the missing hours or the pressure or the returned tools or the wet drag marks on cabin walls. Those things were terrifying. I will never insult the fear by pretending otherwise. But they were all symptoms of a deeper and more human ugliness. What nearly destroyed us was the way we had treated relation as possession. The way men like my father, and if I am honest, men like me too, look at land and think the final moral act is to put our names on it, square it, improve it, build hard corners into it until it resembles the inside of our heads. We had not been punished for curiosity. We had been corrected for arrogance. for seeing a sign and calling it junk because it did not fit the language of ownership we preferred. That was the true horror. Not that something old guarded the line, that we were so prepared to erase the line and still call ourselves reasonable. I stayed by the pond until the sun shifted far enough west to silver the water differently. Then I went back to the porch and sat in the second chair Dad and I had finally bought, because some changes really are that simple after all. He called just before dusk. No emergency in his voice. No breathless need to know whether anything was wrong. Just a man checking in on his son at the cabin. "How is it?" he asked. I looked out at the clearing, the marker low near the grass, the pines breathing in evening air, the first faint ripple moving across the pond. "It's good," I said. There was a pause on the line, and I knew he was hearing more than the words. Then he said, "Yeah." We sat in silence for a moment, miles apart and still somehow sharing the same porch. After we hung up, I stayed outside until the first stars appeared. Not to test the place, not to prove anything, just because it was beautiful, and I was finally able to let that beauty exist without demanding it belonged to me. I have tried, since then, to tell this story honestly. That means not turning it into a campfire monster tale, and not sanding it down into a lesson so clean it could hang in a gift shop. It also means admitting that the ending people want a dead evil thing. A burned cabin, a priest, a curse broken in thunder is not the ending that happened. There was no monster to kill. There was no enemy to defeat. There was a line damaged by people who thought paper overruled memory. There was a debt carried quietly through my family until silence itself became part of the damage. There was a place that responded not with random hunger, but with long, patient correction. And when the right thing was returned to the right place by people finally willing to stop treating themselves as the final authority over it, the haunting ended because the argument ended. That is as close to a happy ending as real life usually gives. My father still has the tremor. He still gets headaches sometimes. I still wake occasionally at night and listen too hard to ordinary house sounds before remembering that ordinary is allowed to exist without hiding a second meaning. The summer did not vanish. The woods did not become a theme park version of safe. I do not say the name that other people use. I do not go blundering into circles of silence just because daylight makes me arrogant. I do not mistake legal ownership for moral permission anymore. But the cabin remains. So does the pond. So do the trees. And what has changed between us, the land, the house, my father? Me is not triumph, only right relation. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like something we had taken. It felt like something we had finally been allowed to keep.